Chapter 1704. In the face of Fu Rui and Quan Feng's provocation, Xiao Chen's reaction was unexpected. Everyone thought that Xiao Chen would back down, but no one expected Xiao Chen to be so strong. Not only did he not back down, he even made Fu Rui suffer a hidden loss. The anger in Yi Zhao's eyes slowly subsided. After Xiao Chen left, Yi Zhao walked up to Fu Rui and Quan Feng. He smiled smugly. "See? I told you not to provoke this lunatic. Sai, if you don't listen to your elders, you'll get the short end of the stick." Yi Zhao put on a pretentious expression. In response, Fu Rui snapped, "Stop pretending." With that, Fu Rui turned and left without waiting for Yi Zhao's reply. He was already angry, but Yi Zhao still wanted to make fun of him at this time. Fu Rui naturally did not feel good about it. After giving Yi Zhao a look, Fu Rui turned and left. Seeing this, Quan Feng did not want to waste any more time with Yi Zhao. This guy was just a pretentious prick. What did he say just now? He clearly did not say anything. Fu Rui and Quan Feng left one after the other. Yi Zhao felt bored and returned to the Black Palace in the 7th realm. After a short meeting, the heirs of each realm parted on bad terms. However, Xiao Chen had left a deep impression on everyone present during this meeting. It could not be helped. He had beaten Fu Rui to the point that he did not lose his temper at all. This was enough to prove Xiao Chen's combat ability. He believed that after this battle, no one in the 8 Barons' immortal realm would look down on Xiao Chen anymore. In everyone's eyes, Xiao Chen was now truly qualified to be on equal footing with the other heirs of Kunlun. He returned to the Black Palace in the 7th realm. As soon as he entered his cave, Luan came up to him. Every time Xiao Chen returned from outside, Luan would stick to Xiao Chen before going off to play by herself. Xiao Chen was already used to having Luan by his side. Hence, when Luan rushed over, he naturally carried her in his arms and walked towards the courtyard. Many experts from the Hachibara Senkai had already gathered in the second wilderness. Many of them had gone to visit their friends, but Xiao Chen was not interested. Moreover, he was only familiar with the 7th and 8th realms in the Hachibara Senkai. As for the other realms, Xiao Chen was not familiar with them. He immediately dismissed the idea of visiting anyone. Moreover, Luo Li had previously sent a message saying that there would be a banquet in the evening and that Xiao Chen should remember to attend. After staying in the cave for a day, Xiao Chen and Hong Xiu left the 7th World's Black Palace at night and arrived at the 2nd World's Palace. They did not bring Luan with them. After all, this banquet was not suitable. They went straight to the place where the banquet would be held. This time, except for the 1st realm, all the other realms of the Hachibara Senkai had gathered together. The purpose of the banquet was to let everyone gather together. The banquet was also very casual. They chose a cave residence with good scenery as the venue for the banquet. They went straight to the cave residence where the banquet was held. After entering the cave residence, no one dared to look down on Xiao Chen this time. Whether they were from the 7th realm or not, the experts of the older generation would nod to Xiao Chen when they saw him, and the young geniuses would salute him respectfully. What a joke! Xiao Chen was someone who even Fu Rui did not dare to offend. How could ordinary geniuses like them dare to offend Xiao Chen? Xiao Chen and Hong Xiu strolled around the cave residence leisurely. There were many people gathered in groups of 3 or 5. There were no rules at this banquet. As long as they were familiar with each other, they could drink together. They could drink wherever they wanted. There were no rules. It had to be said that Xiao Chen could accept this Hachibara Senkai banquet. It was not like the banquet in the 7th wilderness. Every banquet had a clear hierarchy. Even the seating arrangements were strictly arranged. Moreover, there were so many rules that it was annoying. He could not drink properly at all. It was better to be like this Hachibara Senkai. There were no rules to be comfortable. It was good to sit together and drink and chat with acquaintances. He did not find anyone he was familiar with. However, when Xiao Chen was wandering around with nothing to do, Xiao Chen suddenly saw Wine Taoist. This guy was drinking with Li Qiu, Gu Feng, and several other experts that Xiao Chen had never seen before. He did not expect Wine Taoist to come as well. Looking at Wine Taoist's blurry eyes, Xiaochen shook his head and smiled. He did not disturb him. Xiaochen said that he was happy to see Wine Taoist integrate into Hachibara Senkai. Thus, he did not need to meddle in other people's business. Xiaochen did not disturb Wine Taoist. He continued walking towards the center of the cave residence. When he came to a bamboo forest, a young genius from the 8th realm hurried over and bowed respectfully to Xiaochen and Hong Xiu. Senior Xiaochen, Senior Sister Hong Xiu, Senior Yi Xiao wants to drink with you. Yi Xiao had specifically sent someone to look for him. Hearing this, Xiaochen did not refuse and nodded slightly. Then, under the guidance of this young genius, he came to a beautiful mountain peak in the cave. At this moment, Yi Xiao, Guanhong, Fu Rui, and the other heirs of Kunlun were already there. Other than them, there were also a dozen beautiful girls. Clearly, they were their women. After all, everyone present was an heir of Kunlun's field. Naturally, the women present would not be bad. Moreover, the women present were all extremely beautiful. Of course, to Xiaochen, this was naturally not enough to attract him. Without wasting any time, he walked towards them. Seeing Xiaochen and Hong Xiu come, Yi Xiao stood up. He looked at Xiaochen with a drunk face and said, "Brother Xiaochen, why are you so late? I've been waiting for you for a long time." "No, I have to drink as punishment." It was obvious that Yi Xiao had drunk too much. Yi Xiao could not hold his liquor well, but he still liked to drink. Every time, he would get himself and Ling Ding drunk. Looking at Yi Xiao, who was a little drunk, Xiaochen nodded slightly and did not say anything. Then, he was pulled to the table by Yi Xiao. When they saw Xiaochen again, Guanhong and the others did not look down on him at all. Clearly, they had already placed Xiaochen on the same level as them. Even Guanhong stood up personally and smiled warmly at Xiaochen. "Brother Xiaochen, come. You're the only one left. Take a seat." Guanhong was very enthusiastic. Even Fu Rui, who was beside him, did not say anything. He only snorted softly but did not say anything. He did not mock Xiaochen either. As for Quan Feng, he smiled at Xiaochen as a greeting. "Please add, vote, recommend." Chapter 1705. No one dared to look down on Xiaochen anymore. Under Yi Xiao and Guanhong's enthusiasm, Xiaochen sat down. Hong Xiu also sat beside Xiaochen obediently. Hong Xiu wasn't nervous at all when she was with the heirs. Furthermore, her status wasn't any lower than any of the heirs present. Therefore, unlike the other women at the table, Hong Xiu was very relaxed and did not feel restrained at all. After all, Hong Xiu was the daughter of the realm lord of the 8th realm. Her status alone was enough to make her as powerful as any of them present. Moreover, Xiaochen and Yi Xiao seemed to be taking good care of Hong Xiu. They also knew Hong Xiu's status. Therefore, Guanhong and the others had seen her before and treated her as a friend. They chatted casually as they drank. As for Xiaochen and Fu Rui, who everyone was most worried about, they clearly did not intend to fight again. Moreover, from their expressions, they did not seem to care about what had happened during the day. That was true. As an heir, if he took such a small matter to heart, then he was indeed too narrow-minded. There was no enmity between him and Fu Rui. They had fought during the day because Fu Rui had asked for it. Naturally, Xiaochen did not take it to heart. On the other hand, although Fu Rui was furious, after his anger subsided, he naturally did not care. As for pride, it was not worth mentioning in Fu Rui's eyes. Moreover, Fu Rui had not lost during the day. Moreover, with Fu Rui's status, there was no need for him to use such methods to save his pride. The two of them did not take what had happened during the day to heart. To them, it was just a small matter. You could treat it as a friendly match. Xiaochen had no intention of continuing the fight. He even drank a few glasses of wine with Fu Rui and Quan Feng as they chatted. The atmosphere was quite harmonious. As they chatted, Guanhong suddenly mentioned the heir of the First World. "Sigh, it's a pity that Senior Mufan didn't come. Otherwise, the 8 heirs of the Hachibara Senkai would all be here." senior brother Mufan is in the first realm. He won't come unless there's something important. Upon hearing his words, even Qiu-Ru, who had always been cold, spoke up. Everyone addressed Mufan as senior brother. However, Xiaochen didn't know anything about this person. Of course, he wasn't interested in finding out anything about him. However, when Guanhong and Qiu-Ru mentioned Mufan, Fu Rui, Quan Feng, and Yi Shao unconsciously looked at Hong Xiu unnaturally. Speaking of Mufan, everyone's gaze turned towards Hong Xiu. Furthermore, from the looks of it, it seemed as though the two of them had some sort of relationship. Although he was confused, Xiaochen didn't ask further. This was Hong Xiu's business with Mufan. It had nothing to do with him. Furthermore, Mufan was the heir of the first realm. He didn't have much to do with him. He continued to drink and didn't interrupt. However, Xiaochen noticed something. When they talked about Mufan, Guanhong and the others seemed to be very respectful. They were all heirs of the first realm, but Guanhong and Qiu-Ru called Mufan senior brother. Didn't this mean that Mufan's status was higher than everyone else's? As heirs of the first realm, they should be on equal footing. However, everyone was respectful to Mufan. This was very strange. Hong Xiu lowered her head and drank alone. However, when she heard Mufan's name, her expression turned ugly. Perhaps because he felt Hong Xiu's expression change, Yi Shao spoke up. All right. Let's not talk about this. It's rare for us to gather together today. Let's drink until we're drunk. Yi Shao took the initiative to change the topic. Seeing this, everyone subconsciously glanced at Hong Xiu. They realized that her expression had indeed darkened. After that, no one mentioned Mufan again. It seemed that Hong Xiu and Mufan did have some sort of relationship. Otherwise, Hong Xiu's expression wouldn't have darkened when she heard Mufan's name. Furthermore, what Xiaochen didn't notice was that when everyone talked about Mufan, Hong Xiu secretly glanced at Xiaochen more than once. Her eyes revealed a hint of worry. It was as if she was afraid that Xiaochen would be angry. Fortunately, Xiaochen didn't seem to be angry. His expression didn't change. Seeing this, Hong Xiu secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Everyone stopped talking about Mufan. Just as the Hachibara Senkai was happily drinking, the strong people from the 8 barren lands gathered in the distant starry sky. At this time, they had also gathered together to host a banquet. However, compared to the Hachibara Senkai, the atmosphere here was a little more oppressive. Just as Xiaochen had expected, the banquet in the 8 barren lands had a clear priority. The atmosphere was extremely oppressive. In the main hall of a floating palace, many strong people from the 8 barren lands gathered together. Everyone took their seats in an orderly manner. Although there were drinks and delicious food placed in front of them, it seemed that everyone didn't have much of an appetite. They only drank a small cup from time to time. The oppressive atmosphere was a little uncomfortable, but everyone present seemed to be used to it. No one showed the slightest bit of uneasiness. On the main seats, the 7 will of the heavenly way from the 8 barren lands were all present. Just like the Hachibara Senkai, except for the will of the heavenly way who was trapped in the first realm, the other 7 will of the heavenly way had all arrived. When they gathered together, the second will of the heavenly way's face was still a little gloomy. Everyone from the Hachibara Senkai has gathered, right? Yes, it looks like this battle is going to be interesting. Hearing this, the third will of the heavenly way laughed softly. I think we should take action tomorrow. There will be a battle sooner or later anyway. Seeing this, the fourth will of the heavenly way said. There would be a battle sooner or later. Sooner or later, there would be a battle. Hearing the fourth will of the heavenly way's words, the other will of the heavenly way nodded in agreement. However, just as everyone was deciding to attack the next day, the 5th Desolate's will of the heavenly way spoke. This war is unprecedented. We have to be fully prepared. If we can't take back the 2nd Desolate, what should we do? We can't keep wasting our time here with the Hachibara Senkai. One must have the belief to win, but one must also be prepared for failure. Hearing the 5th will of the heavenly way's words, everyone's eyes focused on the 2nd will of the heavenly way. After all, he was the master of the second barren lands. What would happen in the end depended on his decision. Under everyone's gaze, the second will of the heavenly way drank the wine in his cup in one gulp. Then, a cold light flashed in his eyes, and he said coldly, "I'd rather die in glory than live in dishonor. Please add, please vote, please recommend." Chapter 1706. It was better to die in glory than to live in dishonor. Hearing the words of the will of the heavenly way, the rest of the will of the heavenly way nodded slightly. That would be for the best. Tomorrow, they would launch an attack to regain control of the second wilderness. Even if they failed, the rest of the will of the heavenly way would have a backup plan. It was a silent night. On this night, the Hachibara Senkai could be said to be full of laughter. It was very clear that although they did not belong to the same world, they knew each other or were familiar with each other. Now, they finally had the opportunity to drink and chat merrily. On the morning of the second day, Xiaochen came to the courtyard early as usual to practice martial arts. Although he drank a lot of wine last night, it was nothing to Xiaochen. After a night of practice, all the wine he drank last night was refined by Xiaochen. It should be known that at Xiaochen's level, the wine he drank was already immortal wine. Every sip of wine was worth no less than an elixir. Therefore, after drinking so much wine, not only did Xiaochen not get drunk, but after Xiaochen refined the spiritual energy in the wine, his cultivation improved a little. As usual, he was practicing martial arts in the courtyard. However, at this moment, the sound of a war drum was heard. Hearing the sound of the war drum, Xiaochen stopped what he was doing and looked into the distance. Needless to say, the experts from the 8 Desolates were attacking. They came very quickly. Now that the war drum sounded, the Hachibara Senkai's figures soared into the sky. Above the starry sky, thousands of Hachibara Senkai's experts were ready for battle. Xiaochen, Hongxiu, and Yishao also rose into the air from the Black Palace of the 7th Realm. They rose into the air and came to the front of the crowd. Wherever they passed, the young geniuses from various realms bowed respectfully to Xiaochen and Yishao. At this moment, Guanhong, Fu Rui, and Quan Feng were also in front of the crowd. They looked into the distant starry sky, their eyes flashing with battle intent. These bastards came quickly. Fu Rui said with a cold smile, his eyes flashing with battle intent. As soon as Fu Rui's voice fell, thousands of experts from the 8 Desolates appeared before everyone's eyes. The two sides faced each other in the dark, endless starry sky. Such a lineup had never been seen in the history of the 8 Desolates world. Both sides added together, there were nearly 20,000 supreme experts above the immortal realm. This number included almost all the supreme experts of the immortal realm in the entire 8 Desolates world. Killing intent appeared in each of their eyes. Just as the two sides were facing each other, the second Desolate, Will of the Heavenly Way and the others finally appeared. There were a total of 7 Will of the Heavenly Way. Many people had never seen such a lineup in their entire lives. At the same time that the 7 Will of the Heavenly Way appeared, Luoli and the others also appeared in front of Xiaochen and the others. The 7 World Lords and the 7 Will of the Heavenly Way stood opposite each other. Both sides were staring at each other. The second Desolate Will of the Heavenly Way was the first to speak. Yi Xian, if you can't protect the second Desolate today, I definitely won't allow the second Desolate to fall into the hands of thieves like you. If you have the ability, then come. I'd like to see how a defeated opponent like you will take back the second Desolate. Hearing this, Yi Xian coldly laughed. Hearing Yi Xian's words, the killing intent in the eyes of the second Desolate, Will of the Heavenly Way, had already reached its peak. This time, losing the second Desolate Will of the Heavenly Way was truly depressing. At the same time, he was also extremely angry. It could be said that it was entirely because of the Hachibara Senkai's scheme that the second Desolate had been lost. How could anyone accept this? With the appearance of the various big shots, the atmosphere in the arena became extremely tense. There was no other way. Whether it was Luoli and the other 7 World Lords, or the second Desolate Will of the Heavenly Way and the others, they were all top experts in the 8 Desolates world. Any one of them could be said to be in existence that could destroy the heavens and the earth. At this moment, with so many top powerhouses gathered in one place, the surrounding space seemed to be unable to withstand the pressure from all the big shots and started to crack. Moreover, the cracks were still expanding in a short period of time. Before they even made a move, the space was already showing signs of collapsing. One could imagine the pressure. It was also because everyone present was at the immortal realm. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't even be able to withstand this pressure. Don't make a move later. After sizing up the experts of the 8 desolate lands, Xiaochen whispered to Hongxiu. Amongst the experts of the 8 desolate lands, Xiaochen discovered that none of them had a cultivation base lower than the immortal realm. In this way, it also meant that the threshold of this war was the immortal realm. If one's cultivation base hadn't reached the immortal realm, he wouldn't be qualified to participate in this war. Otherwise, he wouldn't even be able to be cannon fodder. He also saw some familiar voices, such as Yangzi, Dragon Emperor, and Xing Zhantian. However, Xiaochen didn't see Xiaosheng, Xianyuan Ling, or Long Qing. It seemed that their cultivation base hadn't reached the immortal realm, so they didn't participate in this war. Of course, Xiaochen didn't know that Xianyuan Ling and Long Qing had actually disappeared after the incident in the first mainland. No one knew where they went. He didn't let Hongxiu make a move because it was very dangerous. Moreover, in such a large-scale war, Xiaochen wouldn't be able to protect Hongxiu at all. Therefore, she naturally couldn't participate in the war. Hearing Xiaochen's words, Hongxiu understood the reason behind it, so she didn't say anything. She nodded obediently as a form of agreement, but at the same time, she reminded Xiaochen to be careful. Xiaochen nodded in response to Hongxiu's reminder. Of course, he wasn't a big shot, so he wouldn't seek death. Moreover, the ones who would determine the outcome of this war were the big shots in front of him. They were the key to determining the outcome of this war. As for Xiaochen, he was indeed too inexperienced. He looked at Luoli and the other sector lords, waiting for their orders. This war was obviously unavoidable, so both sides didn't waste any time. Soon, Second Desolate Will of the Heavenly Way shouted loudly, "Kill! Kill these bastards and take back Second Desolate!" Second Desolate Will of the Heavenly Way shouted angrily. Then, the experts from the 8 Desolates rushed towards Xiaochen and the others. At the same time, the people from the Hachibara Senkai naturally wouldn't allow themselves to be captured without putting up a fight. The young supreme talents whose cultivation hadn't reached the immortal realm took the initiative to retreat to the top of the palace. The remaining experts from the Hachibara Senkai also fearlessly clashed with the experts from the 8 Desolates head-on. At the same time, Luoli and the other sector lords were also engaged in a fierce battle with the 7 Will of the Heavenly Way. However, their battlefield was obviously different. At this moment, the space where Luoli and the others were fighting had been completely isolated. Those whose cultivation hadn't reached the immortal Emperor realm couldn't even get close to it. Please collect, vote, recommend. Chapter 1707. The battle between the Realm Lords and the Will of the Heavenly Tao was something that no one else could interfere with. At this time, Xiaochen had also passed by and was fighting fiercely with an unknown immortal venerable. Xiaochen had never seen this immortal venerable before. This person should not be an expert from the 7th wilderness. Therefore, Xiaochen did not show any mercy in the battle. The immortal venerable's cultivation base was at the initial stage of the immortal venerable realm, but he was infinitely close to the initial stage of the immortal venerable realm. Even so, this immortal venerable was still unable to gain any advantage over Xiaochen. In the blink of an eye, the two of them had exchanged more than 100 moves. Xiaochen was not at a disadvantage at all. Seeing this, the immortal venerable's eyes flashed with a hint of surprise, but it was only for a moment. Then, his hands did not stop moving, but he still asked coldly. I've long heard that the 8 heirs of the Hachibara Senkai are all geniuses among geniuses. Today, I've seen that they live up to their reputation. You're able to fight an immortal venerable with your cultivation base at the culmination of the immortal venerable realm. Which realm are you from? The 8 heirs of the 8 Barren Immortal Realm were famous in the 8 Barren Immortal Realm, but they were definitely well known. This was the first time that the Immortal Venerable had fought an heir of the Hachibara Senkai. He also affirmed Xiao Chen's strength. Indeed, only the 8 heirs of the Hachibara Senkai could fight an Immortal Venerable with their cultivation base at the Immortal Venerable Realm. Upon hearing the Immortal Venerable's words, Xiao Chen replied indifferently, "The 7th realm." Xiao Chen did not have any hatred for this Immortal Venerable. However, they were destined to be enemies because of their different standpoints. In the face of Xiao Chen's answer, the Immortal Venerable did not react at first, but soon, his face darkened. "The 7th realm? Are you Xiao Chen?" Xiao Chen, the heir of the 7th realm, used to be the first saint of the 7th wilderness. Now, Xiao Chen was quite famous in the 8 wilderness. Of course, most of his fame was bad. The reason was simple. In the eyes of many cultivators in the 8th Baron, Xiao Chen had once been the first saint of the 7th Baron territory, the first of the younger generation. But now, he had become the heir of the 7th realm. That made him a traitor. His eyes suddenly flashed with anger. Everyone hated traitors, but these people didn't know the truth. Looking at Xiao Chen with burning anger, the Immortal Venerable changed his attitude and shouted angrily with a murderous look, "So you're Xiao Chen, the traitor of the 7th wilderness? Good, very good. Today, I will personally destroy you." Traitor? Kill him with his own hands? Xiao Chen's expression didn't change at all when he heard the words of this Immortal Venerable. He had seen such a scene too many times. Traitor? These insults that seemed hurtful were not important to Xiao Chen at all. They couldn't cause any ripples in his heart. Whether he was a traitor or a thief, Xiao Chen knew that he couldn't change the opinions of these people. But what could he do? Xiao Chen was still Xiao Chen. Without answering the Immortal Venerable, Xiao Chen slashed out with his sword and answered him with his actions. "You want to kill me? Let's see if you have the ability to do so." After knowing Xiao Chen's identity, the Immortal Venerable's attacks were obviously more ruthless. It was as if he had to kill Xiao Chen no matter what. In fact, there were many times when this Immortal Venerable was willing to sacrifice himself in exchange for Xiao Chen's injury, intending to grind him to death. As an Immortal Venerable, it was needless to say that he wanted to take advantage of Kendi. However, Xiao Chen wasn't an ordinary immortal. In other words, even among the 8 heirs of the Hachibara Senkai, Xiao Chen's physical body was absolutely top-notch. Xiao Chen was getting more and more curious about the origin of the tempered battle body. When Xiao Chen first obtained the tempered battle body, he only felt that it was very strong. However, after reaching the Immortal Realm, Xiao Chen had already come into contact with immortal techniques. The tempered battle body was still ridiculously strong. In Xiao Chen's opinion, the grade of the tempered battle body was probably higher than the 3rd grade immortal technique. He was really curious about the origin of the tempered battle body. However, Xiao Chen had tried to find the records of the tempered battle body, but after reading all the ancient books in the 7th realm, Xiao Chen still couldn't find any clues. The tempered battle body was getting more and more mysterious in Xiao Chen's eyes. However, there was no doubt about its strength. It was just that it was too difficult to cultivate. He didn't realize that Xiao Chen's physical body would be so strong. After exchanging blows several times, Xiao Chen was still fine, but this Immortal Venerable was already injured. With the strong defense and fast recovery ability of the tempered battle body, Xiao Chen wasn't afraid of exchanging blows with this Immortal Venerable. Moreover, the final result was indeed shocking. An Immortal Realm cultivator and an Immortal Venerable exchanged blows, and the Immortal Venerable actually fell into a disadvantageous position. Such a thing could only be described as a miracle. Seeing that Xiao Chen wasn't afraid of exchanging blows with him and even had the upper hand, the Immortal Venerable said with a gloomy face, "You're indeed one of the 8 heirs of the Hachibara Senkai. However, even if I die today, I'll take you with me." Foolish loyalty. Upon hearing the Immortal Venerable's words, Xiao Chen indifferently spat out 2 words and then took the initiative to attack. The experts of 8 Desolates were indeed foolishly loyal to the will of the Heavenly Way, as if they couldn't wait to dig out their hearts at any time to prove their loyalty to the will of the Heavenly Way. In Xiao Chen's eyes, such loyalty couldn't be considered as loyalty at all. It was pathetic and ridiculous. The fierce battle continued. Xiao Chen's attacks didn't weaken at all. Just like what he said, the immortal venerable was determined to kill Xiao Chen today even if he had to risk his life. While the two were engaged in a fierce battle, a flash of lightning suddenly appeared in the originally calm starry sky. Then, a rain of blood fell from the sky, accompanied by cries. Lightning flashed, thunder rumbled, rain of blood fell, and cries were all signs that indicated the fall of an immortal realm expert. The battle had only started for less than half an hour, but an immortal realm expert had already fallen. Amidst the rain of blood, many people saw Fu Rui tearing a mighty expert of the immortal realm from 8 wildernesses into 2 halves. No wonder. It turned out that he was fighting against Fu Rui. In that case, there was nothing strange about it. Although Fu Rui was also an immortal realm expert, his combat strength was close to the immortal venerable realm. It wasn't impossible for him to kill an immortal realm expert. Moreover, the immortal realm expert who was killed had just broken through to the immortal realm. Therefore, it was normal for him to be killed since his cultivation base was lower than Fu Rui's. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation. Chapter 1708. It hadn't even been an hour since the battle began, and a mighty immortal had already fallen. The crowd wasn't too surprised by this outcome, but they were still shocked. This time, the experts of 8 Desolation and Achibara Senkai had gathered together. In such a large-scale battle, there would definitely be casualties. Therefore, before the battle began, everyone had already mentally prepared themselves. However, no one had expected that a mighty immortal would fall so quickly. The battle had just begun, and there were already mighty immortals from 8 Desolation who had fallen. Following the death of a mighty immortal, Fu Rui, Xiao Chen, and the other heirs of Hachibara Senkai became more and more dangerous in everyone's eyes. The heirs of Hachibara Senkai were already famous in 8 Desolation World. Now, the strength that these heirs of 8 Desolation World displayed was indeed impressive. Anyway, after witnessing Fu Rui kill a mighty immortal, everyone present had already regarded them as immortal venerables. Although their cultivation was still in the immortal realm, in terms of combat strength, Xiao Chen and the other heirs of 8 Desolation World were definitely comparable to immortal venerables. Realizing this, a mighty immortal venerables immediately took the initiative to confront Fu Rui. At the same time, the other heirs of 8 Desolation World were also dealt with by mighty immortal venerables. Cultivation in the immortal realm was no longer enough to deal with Xiao Chen and the other heirs of 8 Desolation World. Only immortal venerables could fight them. Of course, if it were immortal emperors, they would definitely be able to kill Xiao Chen and the other heirs of 8 Desolation World. However, there weren't many immortal emperors in the first place. Now that the battle had begun, the immortal emperors already had their own opponents. For a moment, no one could escape. Therefore, only immortal venerables could deal with Xiao Chen and the other heirs of 8 Desolation World. All the immortal venerables attacked together. For a moment, Xiao Chen and the other immortal venerables were also fighting against each other. Naturally, it wouldn't be easy to deal with immortal venerables. Compared to immortal realm experts, immortal venerables were much stronger. An intense battle erupted. Following the death of the immortal realm expert, the battle between the two sides grew even more intense. Xiao Chen didn't dare to hold back in the fierce battle with this immortal venerable. Of course, with his strong physique and terrifying combat strength, Xiao Chen still had the upper hand. An immortal realm junior was actually able to gain the upper hand in the face of an immortal venerable. If this were to spread out, no one would believe it, but this was the truth. Knowing how strong Xiao Chen's body was, this immortal venerable didn't dare to exchange injuries with Xiao Chen. He finally realized that if he were to exchange injuries with Xiao Chen, he would definitely be at a disadvantage. With his terrifying physical defense and freakishly fast recovery ability, Xiao Chen was not afraid of exchanging injuries with him at all. It was impossible for him to exhaust Xiao Chen to death. Therefore, this immortal venerable changed his strategy. He wanted to suppress Xiaochen with the advantage of his cultivation base. Unfortunately, this idea didn't work. After condensing the heavenly immortal mansion, Xiaochen's spiritual energy reserve wasn't much weaker than that of an immortal venerable. In terms of quality, Xiaochen, who had the heavenly immortal mansion, was stronger than this immortal venerable by a notch. Even with the advantage of his cultivation base, he still couldn't suppress Xiaochen. Only now did this immortal venerable fully understand how strong the heirs of Hachibara Senkai were. He couldn't gain any advantage over Xiaochen. In the fierce battle, this immortal venerable felt more and more aggrieved because he didn't have much chance to counterattack when facing Xiaochen. He could only defend passively. The 9 nether sword arts slashed out unceasingly, sending terrifying swords towards the immortal venerable. Facing each of Xiaochen's sword strikes, this immortal venerable had to be careful and didn't dare to let his guard down. Xiaochen was no stranger to immortal venerables. Moreover, Xiaochen had already killed an immortal venerable before. Back in the 7th realm, Xiaochen had killed Mo Qingshu, who was also an immortal venerable. However, compared to this person, Mo Qingshu's strength was obviously weaker. He was only at the beginning of the immortal venerable realm and probably wasn't a match for this immortal venerable. However, after this period of cultivation, Xiaochen's cultivation base had already broken through to the immortal venerable realm. Compared to when he killed Mo Qingshu, he was also much stronger. As the battle continued, Xiaochen's advantage grew. On the other hand, the immortal venerable became more and more aggrieved. Both of them had many wounds on their bodies. Of course, Xiaochen's condition was obviously better. Once again, Xiaochen slashed out with his sword. A trace of coldness flashed in his eyes. He looked coldly at this immortal venerable and said, "It seems like you can't kill me today." Indeed, this immortal venerable couldn't kill Xiaochen. Not only that, but after several hours of fierce battle, this immortal venerable's injuries had become very serious. Xiaochen also saw the opportunity to kill him. Hearing this immortal venerable's face turned gloomy. He naturally knew his situation, but he couldn't retreat at this time. Or it could be said that he had nowhere to retreat. This was a life and death battle. Everyone will of the heavenly way was determined to take back the second desolate land. As an expert of the 8 desolate land, this immortal venerable naturally couldn't choose to retreat at this time. There wasn't the slightest intention to retreat in his eyes. On the contrary, this immortal venerable's eyes flashed with determination. He looked at Xiaochen and said fiercely, "Xiaochen, even if I die today, I won't let you go." He had already made up his mind to die, but what could he do about it? There was a gap in strength that couldn't be made up. It wasn't something that could be changed by risking one's life. He was no longer afraid of death. Then, the two of them fought fiercely for several hours. During this period, people from both sides kept falling. However, up until now, the people who fell were basically immortal venerable experts. For the time being, there were no casualties among the experts above the immortal venerable realm. However, this was only temporary, because at this time, the battle on Xiaochen's side was about to come to an end. After several hours of fierce battle, the immortal venerable expert who was fighting against Xiaochen was already an arrow at the end of its flight. Xiaochen didn't give him the slightest chance. He slashed out with his sword, displaying the 9 nether sword art. At the same time, Xiaochen didn't stop. Then, he pointed out his finger and shot out the Xianyuan sword finger. 2 attacks were launched at the immortal venerable expert almost at the same time. Originally, he was already seriously injured. Facing Xiaochen's continuous attacks, he no longer had any ability to resist. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation. Chapter 1709. The 2 swords slashed at the immortal venerable at almost the same time. Then, the immortal venerable, who was already severely injured, was hit by the 2 swords. Obviously, Xiaochen did not hold back at all in these 2 swords. After being hit, the immortal venerable's vitality quickly dissipated even though he was extremely unwilling to accept the outcome. Xiaochen had killed the celestial venerable. At the same time, there was finally a fall of a mighty figure above the celestial venerable realm in the battle. Following the death of the immortal venerable, the expressions of the people from 8 Desolation changed drastically. It couldn't be helped. The value of an immortal venerable was incomparable to that of an immortal venerable. Even in 8 Desolation and Hachibara Senkai, an immortal venerable was considered a formidable combat force. His eyes were filled with unwillingness as he looked at Xiao Chen. Facing the dying gaze of the immortal venerable, Xiao Chen's expression didn't change at all. He merely said, "I have no choice but to serve my own master." After experiencing so many things, Xiao Chen actually had his own views on good and evil. It was actually very difficult to judge pure good and evil. Based on the current situation, in the eyes of this immortal venerable, Xiao Chen was evil, and he was the kind of evil that was unpardonable. He felt that he was sincere, but on the other hand, in the eyes of the people from Hachibara Senkai, the people from 8 Desolation were hypocrites. They claimed to be righteous, but in fact, they were all hypocrites. In Xiao Chen's opinion, an evil person would always have a good side in the eyes of some people. Therefore, good and evil couldn't be judged from the surface. Because of this, Xiao Chen didn't feel that he had killed an evil person, nor did he think that this immortal venerable deserved to be killed. Just like what Xiao Chen had said, on the battlefield, everyone became enemies because of their different standpoints. It had nothing to do with good or evil. As soon as Xiao Chen's voice faded, the immortal venerable's face was filled with confusion. But soon, the light in his eyes dimmed, and the last trace of vitality in his body was completely extinguished. At the same time, another immortal venerable from 8 Desolation glared at Xiao Chen with bloodshot eyes. His face was filled with killing intent. "Brother Luo, Xiao Chen, you bastard. Hand over your life." His face was filled with grief and killing intent. Obviously, this immortal venerable was his good friend. Now that he saw his good friend being killed by Xiao Chen, the hatred in his heart must have soared to the heavens. Xiao Chen didn't respond to his words. Just as the immortal venerable was about to attack Xiao Chen, he was stopped by his opponent, an immortal venerable from the 8 Desolates immortal world. It's not a good habit to be distracted during a battle. Of course, he wouldn't allow this immortal venerable to attack Xiao Chen. However, it was obvious that this immortal venerable's hatred for Xiao Chen had seeped deep into his bones. This was the difference between good and evil. If I killed your friend, I would be an evil person to you, but to the people around me, I would still be me. In some people's eyes, Xiao Chen was an unpardonable villain, but in others' eyes, Xiao Chen was their best friend, family member, and brother. Good and evil were never absolute. It depended on the person. Most of the time, it was because of different standpoints that there was a distinction between good and evil. Seeing that the immortal venerable expert was stopped, Xiao Chen didn't bother about him. His current situation wasn't very good. Xiao Chen had consumed a lot of his strength after killing the first immortal venerable. If he continued to fight with the second immortal venerable expert, it would be very difficult for Xiao Chen. His combat strength was strong, but he wasn't invincible. Therefore, Xiao Chen didn't bother about him. After swallowing a healing pill, Xiao Chen picked out some warriors of the celestial plane to fight. Fighting against a celestial realm cultivator was naturally a lot less stressful. Given Xiao Chen's current cultivation realm and combat strength, it was almost his limit to be able to defeat and kill a celestial venerable at his peak. If he had to fight immortal venerables continuously, Xiao Chen really couldn't do it. Therefore, Xiao Chen consciously stopped fighting immortal venerables. Instead, he chose some immortal realm experts. Xiao Chen wasn't afraid of those at the same cultivation base, even if they were at the great attainment of the immortal realm. Moreover, he didn't feel too much pressure. After Xiao Chen killed an immortal venerable expert, the morale of the Hachibara Senkai's side soared. After all, their heir had killed an immortal venerable expert. This was definitely a result that boosted their morale. On the other hand, the morale of the 8 barons' side was much lower after the death of an immortal venerable expert. As a result, the battle seemed to be tilting towards the Hachibara Senkai's side. The Realm Lords and the Will of the Heavenly Way also noticed this change. the killing intent in the eyes of the will of the heavenly way from the seventh realm was extremely intense. It was Xiaochen again. For some reason, Xiaochen seemed to be the nemesis of the 8 barons. He was just an insignificant ant, but he was able to change the situation every time. Although Xiaochen had killed an immoral venerable expert, it wasn't enough to defeat the 8 barons or cause any substantial damage. However, the impact on the morale of the 8 barons was huge. The most important point was Xiaochen's cultivation. Killing an immoral venerable expert with his cultivation of the immoral venerable realm was a great boost to the morale of the 8 barons. They increasingly felt that it was a mistake not to kill Xiaochen. However, the 7th Baron Will of the Heavenly Way couldn't spare any time to deal with Xiaochen because he was tightly entangled by Luoli. As if sensing the change in the 7th Baron Will of the Heavenly Way, Luoli said indifferently, "7th Baron, I really have to thank you. If it weren't for you, how could the 7th Realm have such a good Eravi?" Upon hearing Luoli's words, the 7th Baron Will of the Heavenly Way's face turned even uglier. He snorted coldly and attacked Luoli even more fiercely. The 7th Baron Will of the Heavenly Way was indeed regretting, but what could he do? Time couldn't be turned back. Even he couldn't turn back time. While the 7th Baron Will of the Heavenly Way and Luoli were fighting to the death, Xiaochen had killed another immoral venerable realm expert from the 8 barons. However, it was at this moment that the Yinyangzi side was in danger. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 1710. Yinyangzi broke through to the immoral realm with the help of the Will of the Heavenly Way from the 7th Wilderness. Not only him, but Xing Zhantian, the Dragon Emperor, and the others also broke through to the immoral realm. However, due to their lack of foundation, the strength of Yinyangzi and the others could only be considered to be at the bottom of the immoral realm. Yinyangzi's opponent was a Hachibara Senkai expert in the lesser mastery of the immoral realm. His cultivation was one stage higher than Yinyangzi's, so after a long battle, Yinyangzi was no match for him. As a matter of fact, Yinyangzi had done well to be able to hold on for so long. But it was a pity that as time passed, defeat was almost inevitable. The injuries on his body were so severe that he could die at any moment. Facing Yinyangzi who was retreating, the Hachibara Senkai expert naturally wouldn't hold back. It was apparent that this Hachibara Senkai expert was determined to kill Yinyangzi on the spot. After killing an immoral realm expert from the 8th Wilderness, Xiaochen inadvertently noticed Yinyangzi's situation. A complicated glint flashed in Xiaochen's eyes as he watched Yinyangzi who was retreating and covered in injuries. Then, he let out a soft sigh and thought to himself. Forget it, based on the attitude of Yinyangzi and the others toward Xiaochen, there was no longer any relationship between them. However, Xiaochen couldn't just watch Yinyangzi get killed in front of him. Xiaochen couldn't change the fact that Yinyangzi and the others chose to be blindly loyal to the Will of the Heavenly Way from the 7th Wilderness and didn't believe in him. However, when Xiaochen first arrived in the 7th mainland, Yinyangzi and the others had indeed provided him with a lot of help. Therefore, Xiaochen couldn't just watch them die. Besides, if it weren't for Yinyangzi and the others who hated him so much, Xiaochen would definitely think of a way to bring them all back to the 7th realm like Wine Daoist. It was a pity that Yinyangzi and the others were different from Wine Daoist. Wine Daoist could try to accept the 7th realm, get used to life in the 7th realm, and even integrate into the 7th realm. However, it was impossible for Yinyangzi and the others. Based on how much Yinyangzi and the others hated Xiaochen, there was no doubt that if Xiaochen brought them back to the 7th realm like Wine Daoist, they would probably die to prove their loyalty. There were many things that Xiaochen couldn't change, but there were also some things that Xiaochen could do. For example, right now, Xiaochen couldn't just watch Yinyangzi get killed. Perhaps with your strength, you shouldn't even be participating in such a battle, Xiaochen thought to himself as he rushed towards Yinyangzi's direction. After all, Yinyangzi and the others didn't rely on their own strength to break through to the immoral realm. As such, they could be said to be the weakest in the immoral realm. In other words, Yinyangzi and the others were the weakest in this battlefield. Any one of the Hachibara Senkai members could probably defeat Yinyangzi and the others, including those in the immortal realm. In this place, Yinyangzi and the others were undoubtedly cannon fodder. That was why Xiaochen said that they shouldn't be participating in this battle at all. Because not only would they not be able to change anything, but they might even lose their lives because of it. It did not take long for Xiaochen to arrive in front of Yinyangzi given his speed. The two people who were fighting fiercely saw Xiaochen arrive. Yinyangzi's eyes immediately erupted with a raging fury as he suddenly yelled, "Xiaochen, you traitor!" His hatred for Xiaochen didn't diminish in the slightest. Xiaochen didn't care about it, but the Hachibara Senkai's immortal realm expert's expression darkened. "You're courting death." Xiaochen was the Hachibara Senkai's heir apparent, but Yinyangzi called Xiaochen a thief. This naturally enraged the Hachibara Senkai expert. Just as he was about to kill Yinyangzi, Xiaochen spoke first. "Leave this to me. Go somewhere else." Xiaochen didn't care about Yinyangzi's scolding because he had expected this outcome before he appeared, so Xiaochen appeared very calm. Upon hearing Xiaochen's words, although the Hachibara Senkai expert still wanted to kill Yinyangzi, he didn't dare to disobey Xiaochen. Although he wasn't from the 7th realm, he still had to respect Xiaochen's words. Besides, this was only a small matter. It wasn't worth it to offend Xiaochen like this. Therefore, without much hesitation, the Hachibara Senkai expert bowed respectfully to Xiaochen, then turned around and left to find other opponents. After the Hachibara Senkai expert left, only Xiaochen and Yinyangzi were left. As for the others, they were busy fighting, so no one noticed Xiaochen. He looked at Yinyangzi expressionlessly. In terms of feelings, Yinyangzi definitely couldn't compare with Xian Yuanling and Wang Qing. Therefore, when facing Yinyangzi, Xiaochen was able to remain calm, at least on the surface. However, when facing Xiaochen, Yinyangzi wasn't like this. His eyes seemed to be spitting fire as he looked at Xiaochen and shouted angrily. "Xiaochen, this old man really regrets not killing you back then. You're a traitor who killed his own father and wife, and betrayed the 7th realm. This old man really misjudged you." Yinyangzi's hatred was still strong. Hearing this, Xiaochen only said indifferently, "No matter what you say, you shouldn't have come to this battle. You're just going to die." As someone from the 7th wilderness, I naturally have to fight for it. If I want to hate someone, I can only hate that I don't have the ability to kill you traitors." Yinyangzi coldly snorted. He was obviously not afraid of death. Perhaps in Yinyangzi's opinion, dying for the will of the heavenly way was an honorable thing to do. After hearing Yinyangzi's reply, Xiaochen didn't say anything else. Yinyangzi's blind loyalty to the will of the heavenly way wasn't something that could be persuaded with just a few words. He was willing to die for the will of the heavenly way at any time. Without wasting any more time, Xiaochen directly slapped him. It was obviously impossible to persuade Yinyangzi to retreat with words, and Xiaochen didn't have time to talk nonsense with him. Therefore, he directly slapped Yinyangzi away. This was the most direct and effective method. Yinyangzi did not have the slightest ability to resist at all. He was hit by Xiaochen's slap, and his body flew out of the battlefield uncontrollably. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 1711. Xiaochen controlled the strength of his slap perfectly. Not only did it send Yinyangzi flying out of the battlefield, but it also made Yinyangzi lose his ability to fight. Knowing Yinyangzi's character, he knew that if Yinyangzi's strength could not be disintegrated by this slap, he would not be afraid of death. Therefore, Xiaochen directly destroyed his strength. With injuries on top of injuries, Yinyangzi, who was sent flying, fainted. However, it was precisely because of this that he could no longer attack. It looked like Xiaochen was attacking Yinyangzi and sending him flying with a slap. However, Xiaochen was actually saving Yinyangzi. Although Yinyangzi's injuries were serious, it was good that he did not have to fight anymore. His life was no longer in danger. Although his injuries were serious, they were not fatal. He just needed some time to recuperate. After personally sending Yinyangzi out of the battlefield, Xiaochen looked at Dragon Emperor, Xing Zhantian, Xianyuan Songtao, and Xianyuan Wudi. There were many experts in the seventh wilderness, but only Yinyangzi and the other four were familiar with Xiao Chen. As for Xiao Sheng and the others, they were not in the immortal realm, so they did not come. After saving Yinyangzi, Xiao Chen glanced at Dragon Emperor, Xing Zhantian, and the others. Then, he sighed and rushed toward the four of them. Since he had already taken action, he might as well save them all. After all, there were only 5 of them and it wouldn't cause too much of a commotion. Moreover, the combat strength of Yinyangzi and the other 4 was already at the bottom of the immortal realm. Losing them wouldn't have much of an impact on the battle. In a flash, Xiao Chen arrived in front of Dragon Emperor. The one who was fighting against Dragon Emperor was an expert in the immortal realm from the 7th realm. Similarly, Dragon Emperor was not his match. Seeing Xiao Chen, the expert from the 7th realm became more respectful. In response, Xiao Chen said indifferently, "Go. You don't have to worry about this." Hearing this, the cultivator from the 7th realm didn't hesitate at all. He immediately turned around and left to find other opponents. After the expert from the 7th realm left, Dragon Emperor's attitude toward Xiao Chen was the same as Yinyangzi's. Because Dragon Emperor's condition was obviously better than Yinyangzi's, he immediately threw a punch at Xiao Chen. A dragon's roar resounded. However, Xiao Chen did not care about Dragon Emperor's attack at all. He only pointed his finger and easily broke Dragon Emperor's attack. He did not even use any martial arts. Dragon Emperor was Long Qing's father. When he was in the 7th mainland, he had helped him a lot. Looking at Dragon Emperor's murderous face, Xiao Chen did not say anything. He directly threw out a palm attack. Just like Yinyangzi, Dragon Emperor could not resist Xiao Chen's palm attack. Moreover, because Dragon Emperor's condition was much better than Yinyangzi's, Xiao Chen's palm attack was stronger. Dragon Emperor was directly sent flying by Xiao Chen's palm attack. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Obviously, he was seriously injured. His injury was as serious as Yinyangzi's, but Xiao Chen was careful not to hurt Dragon Emperor's vital parts. He just temporarily lost his fighting ability. After a period of rest, he would recover. There would not be any hidden injuries left. The intense pain caused Dragon Emperor to lose consciousness as he was sent flying, just like Yinyangzi. Once again, he sent Dragon Emperor flying out of the battlefield and made him lie down with Yinyangzi. After doing all this, Xiao Chen went to Xing Zhantian, Xianyuan Songtao, and Xianyuan Wudi. The 3 of them hated Xiao Chen to the core. Xiao Chen did not waste time talking to them. He threw out 3 palm attacks. The 3 of them suffered the same fate as Yinyangzi and Dragon Emperor. They were all seriously injured and fell unconscious. They were eliminated from the battle. It seemed like Xiao Chen had injured the 5 of them. However, in reality, Xiao Chen was trying to save them. If it was not for Xiao Chen, the 5 of them would have been killed. After all, the 5 of them did not have the ability to protect themselves in such a high-level battle. Xiao Chen used the simplest and most brutal method to save Yinyangzi and the other 4. As for the others, Xiao Chen did not care about them. After all, they had nothing to do with him. Xiao Chen would not be so kind. On the contrary, after saving Yinyangzi and the other 4, Xiao Chen began his massacre again. Xiao Chen only showed kindness to the people around him. He did not show any mercy to the other experts from 8 Desolates. Moreover, they were enemies. Ordinary Immortal Realm experts were no match for Xiao Chen at all. After killing 2 Immortal Realm experts from the 8 barren lands in a row, an Immortal Venerable finally appeared and stopped Xiao Chen. This Immortal Venerable had a cultivation base of initial success. However, Xiao Chen did not have the strength to kill him. After all, Xiao Chen had consumed a lot of his energy. It was impossible for him to kill another Immortal Venerable. He could only entangle and contend with him. The battle gradually fell into a stalemate. Although the Hachibara Senkai had a slight advantage, this advantage could not play a decisive role in the final outcome. Therefore, both sides were in a stalemate. No one could do anything to the other. However, there were people dying constantly. There were people from both Eight Desolates and Hachibara Sankai. It would be difficult to determine the winner. Moreover, even if the battle continued, both sides would suffer great losses. Moreover, the most important thing was the battle between the Sector Lord and the will of the Heavenly Way. The outcome of the battle was the key to the final outcome. Even if the people below were all dead, as long as a victor could be determined between them, then the final outcome would be enough to be determined. However, the battle between Luoli and the other Sector Lords and the will of the Heavenly Way was even more difficult to determine the winner. At their level, they were almost immortal existences. It would not be easy to determine the winner. Moreover, everyone's strength was about the same. Moreover, Luoli himself had said that these immortal emperors did not have the ability to kill the will of the Heavenly Way. At most, they could only contend against it. The fierce battle continued. The casualties on both sides were getting heavier and heavier. Up until now, both sides had paid a huge price. At this time, Yi Xian, who had been fighting fiercely with the will of the Heavenly Way in the Second Desolation, looked at the will of the Heavenly Way with a mischievous smile and said, "Second Desolation, is there a need? The matter is already settled. Why don't we each take a step back and give the Second Desolation to me? I'll give you some compensation, just. How about 10 immortal level pills? 10 immortal level pills in exchange for the entire Second Desolation?" Hearing this, the Second Desolation's will of the Heavenly Way's face immediately turned black like the bottom of a pot. His teeth were about to chatter as he angrily said, "Bullshit, Yi Xian. I'll definitely kill you today. Please collect, please vote, please recommend." Chapter 1712. Yi Xian wanted to exchange 10 immortal grade pills for the entire Second Wasteland. Hearing this, the Second Wasteland will of the Heavenly Way was so angry that he almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Shameless, absolutely shameless. The Second Desolate will of the Heavenly Way naturally wasn't unfamiliar with Yi Xian. The two of them had been old rivals for many years. As the saying goes, the person who understands you the most is usually your enemy. Therefore, the Second Desolate will of the Heavenly Way had a good understanding of Yi Xian. However, it had to be said that the Second Desolate will of the Heavenly Way seemed to have underestimated Yi Xian's shamelessness. Seeing the Second Desolate will of the Heavenly Way blow his beard in anger, the smile on Yi Xian's face became even more brilliant. "What is it? Too little? Sigh, it's not that I want to criticize you, but Second Desolate, you're just too greedy. Alright, 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 alright. As you wish, I'll add another one. How about 11 immortal grade pills? I can't afford any more, or I won't be able to afford it." As he spoke, Yi Xian purposely revealed a pained expression. It felt as if he was saying that these 11 immortal grade pills were really all of his belongings. Looking at Yi Xian's appearance, the anger in the Second Desolate will of the Heavenly Way's heart was already indescribable. He angrily shouted, "Shut up." Then, he fiercely punched towards Yi Xian. Although immortal grade pills were precious, they definitely weren't precious to such an extent. As the Realm Master of the Second Realm and an immortal emperor, how could Yi Xian lack immortal grade pills? Moreover, was it possible to use immortal grade pills to exchange for the Second Desolate? What a joke! Facing Yi Xian's shamelessness, the Second Desolate will of the Heavenly Way was so angry that he almost vomited blood. In the end, no matter what Yi Xian said, the Second Desolate will of the Heavenly Way didn't pay any attention to him. He only attacked as if he wanted to tear Yi Xian apart. The various Realm Masters and the will of the Heavenly Way were engaged in a fierce battle. However, judging from the current situation, it was still impossible to determine the victor. Ordinary injuries were nothing to experts of their level. To put it this way, Xiao Chen's 100 refinement battle body had a rapid recovery ability, and this ability was actually the strongest part of the 100 refinement body. However, the various Realm Masters and the will of the Heavenly Way, their recovery abilities were at least several of times greater than Xiao Chen's, at least 10 times. With such a terrifying recovery ability and an almost indestructible physical defense, it would naturally not be easy for them to determine the victor. Of course, the reason why the various realm masters and the will of the heavenly way had such a terrifying recovery ability was completely because of their cultivation realms. On the other hand, Xiaochen cultivated the 100 refinement battle body. If nothing unexpected happened, once Xiaochen reached the immortal emperor realm one day, his physical strength and recovery ability would probably be even stronger than Luoli and the others. This was the effect of the 100 refinement battle body. No one could interfere in the battle between the various realm masters and the will of the heavenly way. Everyone could only do what they could and try to kill as many people as possible. The fierce battle continued, and Xiaochen was also entangled by an immortal sovereign, making it difficult for him to attack the other immortal realm experts. The battle had indeed fallen into a stalemate. At the same time, in the Black Palace of the Seventh Realm, Wine Daoist and Luan Luan were standing outside the cave, watching the battle from afar. Wine Daoist did not participate in this battle. Regarding this, neither Xiaochen nor the others from the Seventh Realm forced him to do so. Everyone knew that Wine Daoist had not really chosen to join the Seventh Realm, so naturally, it was impossible for him to fight for the Hachibara Senkai against the Eight Desolations. Wine Daoist's eyes flashed with a touch of complexity as he watched the fierce battle between the two parties. In fact, during this period of time in the Hachibara Senkai, Wine Daoist had been living a very comfortable life. The attachment he had for the Seventh Desolation and the trust he had for the will of the heavenly way had slowly faded away. In fact, Wine Daoist had slowly gotten used to life in the Seventh Realm, unlike when he had just arrived. Wine Daoist had also met many like-minded friends here. Wine Daoist felt very good being with these friends. Other things aside, at least he was much more relaxed than when he was in the Seventh Desolation. However, although he had already tried to slowly accept the Seventh Realm, it was not so easy to completely change Wine Daoist in a short period of time. Luan Luan, who had been watching the battle, asked with a puzzled expression, "Grandmaster, father is fighting these bad guys. Why aren't you going?" Wine Daoist was Xiaochen's master, so Luan Luan naturally called him Grandmaster. When he heard Luan Luan's words, Wine Daoist gently touched Luan Luan's forehead and said faintly, "Grandmaster doesn't need to do anything now. When the time comes, Grandmaster will naturally take action." There were many things that could not be explained clearly to Luan Luan, and Wine Daoist had no intention of explaining too much to Luan Luan, so he casually found an excuse to brush her off. When Luan Luan heard Wine Daoist's words, she nodded as if she understood. Soon after, she could no longer endure the loneliness and went to play by herself. Behind her were two maids who followed closely behind her. Ever since she had acknowledged Xiaochen as her father, Luan Luan's life had indeed been very good. Whether it was Xiaochen, Hongxiu, or even Wine Daoist, everyone liked this little girl very much. During this period, Luan Luan could be said to be the moon surrounded by stars. As a result, Luan Luan's personality had become much more cheerful. Of course, she had also become somewhat mischievous. Wine Daoist shook his head and smiled when he saw Luan Luan playing by the side. This little girl was not worried about Xiaochen at all. However, according to her, her father would not lose. Her father was the most powerful person in the world. Wine Daoist had a mysterious confidence in Xiaochen. He no longer paid attention to Luan Luan and fixed his eyes on the battlefield. However, at this moment, Wine Daoist suddenly noticed that an immortal venerable from the Seventh World who was familiar with Wine Daoist was being pressured by an immortal venerable from the Eight Desolaces. The situation had become very dangerous. The immortal venerable from Eight Desolation was a perfect immortal venerable, while the immortal venerable from the Seventh World was only a great perfection immortal venerable. There was a difference of 2 minor realms between the two. Therefore, the immortal venerable from the Seventh World was naturally not a match for the immortal venerable. Wine Daoist's eyes revealed a trace of hesitation when he saw the immortal venerable's critical situation. This immortal venerable was one of the few close friends of Wine Daoist in the Seventh World. They had a good relationship and often got along well with each other. His name was Chinakue. Wine Daoist was hesitating whether he should save Chinakue or not. If he didn't, Chinakue would most likely die. If he saved Chinakue, It would mean that he had to confront the 8 Desolation head-on. Therefore, Wine Taoist was in a dilemma. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation. Chapter 1713. Wine Taoist hesitated when he saw that his friend was in danger. He used to be an expert of the 8 Desolation, but now, did he really have to stand on the opposite side of the 8 Desolation and fight the experts of the 8 Desolation? He was not ready to face the 8 Desolation head-on, but the current situation did not allow him to hesitate any longer. Chinakue's situation was getting worse. It was not easy for Chinakue to persist until now in the face of an enemy who was 2 levels higher than him. Wine Taoist did not hesitate for too long. After about 10 breaths, he made a decision. He turned to look at Luan and said, "Luan, Grandmaster will be back soon. You stay here obediently." After instructing Luan, Wine Taoist took a step forward and disappeared from where he was standing. With 2 personal maidservants taking care of Luan in the 7th realm, Wine Taoist was not worried about her safety. It seemed like a long distance with a single step, but with Wine Taoist's cultivation, he covered the distance in the blink of an eye. At this time, Chinakue was already exhausted from running for his life. Seeing this, the expert from the 8 Desolation immediately threw out a punch. His eyes were full of killing intent as he shouted coldly, "Hachibara Senkai bastard, die!" Obviously, he had already decided to kill Chinakue. If the punch landed, Chinakue would be seriously injured even if he did not die. Seeing the terrifying fist coming straight at him, Chinakue wanted to resist, but his body could no longer exert any strength. After such a long battle, the spiritual energy in Chinakue's body had long been exhausted. At the same time, the injuries on his body were also very serious. A hint of bitterness appeared in Chinakue's eyes. Just when Chinakue himself thought that he would not be able to escape this calamity, a palm suddenly shot out from behind Chinakue and collided violently with the fist light. The person who saved Chinakue was naturally Wine Taoist. Wine Taoist's cultivation was also at the complete immortal venerable realm, and he was still in peak condition. Compared to the expert from the 8 Desolation, Wine Taoist obviously had the upper hand. Therefore, when the fist and palm collided, the 2 of them cancelled each other out as expected. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the Wine Taoist flashed and appeared in front of Chinakue, protecting him behind him. Chinakue didn't expect the Wine Taoist to appear here. "Old drunkard, you!" Chinakue, who was already heavily injured, shouted. Of course, Chinakue knew about Wine Taoist. Therefore, Wine Taoist had not joined the 7th realm and Chinakue had never forced him to do so. But now, Wine Taoist had saved him. Chinakue would be lying if he said that he was not grateful. Chinakue wanted to say something, but before he could say anything, the Wine Taoist interrupted him. "Old man Chen, let's talk when we get back. Heal your injuries first." The Wine Taoist knew what Chinakue wanted to say, but now was obviously not the time to dwell on it. Upon hearing the Wine Taoist's words, Chinakue nodded and retreated a distance away from the battlefield. He swallowed a healing pill and began to heal his injuries. After successfully saving Chinakue, the Wine Taoist shifted his gaze to the expert from the 8 Desolation. The middle-aged man was definitely not from the 7th Desolation, so the Wine Taoist didn't recognize him. Without wasting any time, the Wine Taoist looked at the middle-aged man and said, "With your current condition, you are no match for me. Leave." Although the Wine Taoist chose to attack, he had no intention of killing the expert from the 8 Desolation. Perhaps he still needed some time. However, after hearing the Wine Taoist's words, the expert from the 8 Desolation didn't have the slightest intention of retreating. On the contrary, the murderous intent in his eyes grew stronger as he stared at the Wine Taoist. "Hachibara Senkai, cut the crap and let's fight." As soon as he finished speaking, the expert from the 8 Desolation didn't give the Wine Taoist a chance to reply. He had already thrown a punch at the Wine Taoist. The Wine Taoist wasn't surprised by the attack from the expert from the 8 Desolation. This was because he had once been the same. For the sake of the will of the heavenly way, he could give up his life at any time. Originally, the Wine Taoist didn't want to attack the expert from the Eight Desolation. However, since the other party had attacked first, the Wine Taoist naturally wouldn't allow himself to be captured without a fight. Immediately, the two of them engaged in a fierce battle. Both of their cultivations were equal, but the Wine Taoist was at his peak at this moment. On the other hand, the expert from the Eight Desolation must have consumed a lot of his energy because of his previous battle with Chenakue. He had also suffered some injuries, even though he had the upper hand. In comparison, the Wine Taoist, who was at his peak, naturally had the upper hand. He immediately suppressed the expert from the Eight Desolation. The Wine Taoist's attack didn't attract too much attention. After all, the battle between the two sides had already reached its climax. No one had the time to pay attention to other people's matters. The battle continued. After 3 days and 3 nights, the will of the Heavenly Way finally gave the order to retreat. After 3 days of fierce fighting, the Eight Desolations hadn't been able to break through the Hachibara Senkai's defensive line. If they continued to fight like this, the losses would be incalculable. Moreover, many experts from both sides were already seriously injured. If they continued to fight, there would probably be a large number of deaths. This was something that no one wanted to see. Retreat. After the second Wasteland's will of the Heavenly Way spat out the cold word retreat, the experts from the Eight Desolations chose to retreat. Just as the experts from the Eight Desolations were retreating, the second Wasteland's will of the Heavenly Way coldly glanced at Yi Xian, Luo Li, and the other Hachibara Senkai realm masters. His eyes were extremely cold as he spoke. Yi Xian, don't even think about getting your hands on the second Wasteland, the Hachibara Senkai. I'll be waiting anytime. Yi Xian lightly smiled when he heard the words of the second Wasteland's will of the Heavenly Way. It could be seen that the second Wasteland's will of the Heavenly Way still hadn't given up. However, this was normal. After all, the importance of the second Wasteland was self-evident. It would be strange if they gave up so easily. As soon as he finished speaking, the second Wasteland's will of the Heavenly Way coldly snorted upon hearing Yi Xian's words. Then, it disappeared along with the rest of the will of the Heavenly Way. After the Eight Desolations temporarily retreated, Luo Li and the other realm masters did not choose to chase after them. After all, blocking the attack of the Eight Desolations this time was indeed very difficult for the Hachibara Senkai. Looking at the many experts below, all of them were heavily injured. If they were to chase after the experts of the Eight Desolations at this time, the result would definitely not be good. This battle could be considered a draw, and at most, it could only be considered a small victory. However, with the retreat of the experts from the Eight Desolations, the Hachibara Senkai could temporarily heave a sigh of relief. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 1714. After 3 days and 3 nights of fierce battle, the Hachibara Senkai finally managed to fend off the counterattack of the Eight Desolation. However, they also paid a great price. Needless to say, almost everyone who participated in the battle was injured. As for the fallen, the Hachibara Senkai had 24 Immortal Realm experts and 2 Immortal Venerables. There were no Immortal Emperors, but there were a few Immortal Emperors who were seriously injured and needed some time to recuperate before they could fully recover. One shouldn't think that this number wasn't a lot at first glance. One should know that the lowest cultivation level of these people was at the Immortal Realm, not the Saint Realm experts. In just one battle, 24 Immortal Realm experts and 2 Immortal Venerables had fallen. And this was only the loss of the Hachibara Senkai. It was estimated that the losses of the Eight Desolation Senkai should be about the same. It wouldn't be any less than the Hachibara Senkai's. Most of the corpses of the fallen experts could no longer be found. Many of the injured experts had also returned to the Hachibara Senkai to recuperate. Xiaochen also suffered some injuries in this battle, but they weren't serious. After swallowing some healing pills, Xiaochen returned to the 7th realm. Luan and Hong Xiu were already waiting for him there. Hong Xiu didn't participate in the battle because her cultivation hadn't broken through to the Immortal Realm. However, she was extremely worried when she saw Xiaochen fighting fiercely. Now that Xiaochen had returned safely, Hong Xiu heaved a sigh of relief. On the other hand, Wine Daoist and Yi Xiao, who were with Xiaochen, saw Hong Xiu's expression. Yi Xiao said with jealousy, "I say, I'm your senior brother. Why don't you care about me at all?" Yi Xiao complained. However, Hong Xiu only glanced at him and said with disdain, "You're born in the year of the cockroach. You're tough. You won't die." Yi Xiao was stunned when he heard Hong Xiu's words. Then, a heartbroken expression appeared on his face. However, Hong Xiu didn't care about it at all. At this moment, there was only Xiaochen in her eyes. Of course, Hong Xiu wasn't the only one who was worried about Xiaochen. Luan Luan was also worried about him. As soon as Xiaochen landed on the ground, she ran towards Xiaochen and called out in a childish voice, "Daddy." Luan Luanchen wasn't worried about Xiaochen's to die. Xiaochen's wants to say, Luan wants to die. Ignoring the bloodstains on his body, Xiaochen carried Luan Luan in his arms, and the group returned to the cave. Xiaochen, Yi Xiao, and Wine Daoist's injuries weren't serious. After consuming healing pills, their injuries quickly stabilized. They only needed to rest for 2 days and they would be fine. After washing up and washing off the bloodstains on their bodies, Xiaochen changed into a new set of clothes and sat on the stone benches in the courtyard. Wine Daoist had been forced to participate in this battle. Xiaochen looked at Wine Daoist and asked, "Old drunkard, have you made up your mind?" Xiaochen was obviously asking Wine Daoist if he had decided to join Hachibara Senkai. Wine Daoist's eyes flashed with confusion when he heard Xiaochen's question, but he quickly recovered and nodded. Yes. Since he had already decided to participate, what was there to hesitate about? After this battle, Wine Daoist's heart had been completely undone. Compared to 8 Desolations, Wine Daoist preferred Hachibara Senkai. Since that was the case, what was there to hesitate about? Xiaochen smiled when he saw Wine Daoist nod. After such a long time, Wine Daoist had finally put an end to his past. Xiaochen was happy to see Wine Daoist join the 7th realm. Therefore, Xiaochen was very supportive of Wine Daoist's decision. Hachibara Senkai was busy dealing with the aftermath of the battle. Of course, these matters were basically handed over to the young geniuses whose cultivation had reached the immortal realm. As they were not strong enough, they could not participate in the battle. Therefore, the work of the front and back was naturally handed over to them. As for the other powerhouses who participated in the battle, they were all busy healing their wounds after the battle. Even Xiaochen and the others were the same. After chatting casually in the courtyard for a while, they all went to heal their wounds. The battle that had lasted for 3 days and 3 nights was finally over. Just as the powerhouses from Hachibara Senkai were busy healing their wounds, the powerhouses from 8 Desolations, who had already retreated, were doing the same. However, the powerhouses from 8 Desolations, who were the will of the heavenly way, were gathered together. Their expressions were extremely ugly. In the main hall, the 7 heavenly sages were gathered together. They had not been able to defeat Hachibara Senkai and take back 2nd Desolation. Therefore, even if they attacked again, it would be difficult to succeed. Damn it, Hachibara Senkai, those bastards. One day, I will tear them apart with my own hands, the will of the heavenly way of the 4th Desolation shouted coldly. Since they had not succeeded in this battle, it was almost impossible for them to take back 2nd Desolation. Therefore, they had to make a choice. Should they continue to fight Hachibara Senkai, or should they do something else? Following the 4th will of the heavenly way of the 7th Desolation, the will of the heavenly way of the 7th Desolation suddenly looked at the will of the heavenly way of the 2nd Desolation and said coldly, "2nd Desolation, what do you think? Have you made up your mind?" The 7 will of the heavenly way of the 7th Desolation knew that it was almost impossible for them to take back 2nd Desolation from Hachibara Senkai. Therefore, they could only do what they had said before, which was to destroy 2nd Desolation. At the very least, they had to turn 2nd Desolation into a land of death. They had to destroy all living things in second desolation and let Hachibara Senkai have a useless, or even a burden, second desolation. However, if they really did that, all living things in second desolation would be doomed. At that time, the billions of living things in second desolation would be completely wiped out, and blood would flow like a river. There were no outsiders present to slaughter all living things in second desolation. Otherwise, if someone heard the will of the heavenly way of the seventh desolation, their first thought would be absurd. The will of the heavenly way, who represented heaven and earth and protected all living things, actually wanted to slaughter all living things under his rule. This was simply crazy, absolutely crazy. However, after hearing the will of the heavenly way of the seventh desolation, the will of the heavenly way of the second desolation pondered for a moment. Then, his eyes revealed a trace of coldness as he said, "All right, let's destroy second desolation. Whatever we can't get, we can't let it fall into the hands of Hachibara Senkai. However, before that, I still need your help. You have seen my origin energy. I want to transfer it from second desolation to the other desolations. Who is willing to accept it?" The will of the heavenly way of the second desolation really wanted to destroy the entire second desolation. Hearing this, everyone looked at each other. Then, the will of the heavenly way of the seventh desolation said, "Come to my seventh desolation. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." Chapter 17:15. In order to destroy the second wilderness will of the heavenly way had to transfer its origin energy to another wilderness, because it was the foundation of the will of the heavenly way. If it was destroyed along with the origin energy of the second desolate world, the will of the heavenly ways would disperse as well. On the other hand, if the second wilderness origin energy was transferred to the seventh wilderness, the second wilderness will of the heavenly way could continue to exist. To put it simply, if the origin energy of the second wilderness was transferred to the seventh wilderness would have two wills of the heavenly ways. At the same time, the spiritual chi of the heavens and earth in the seventh wilderness would be at least twice as dense as before. It would be more suitable for cultivation and the growth of various spiritual herbs and spiritual fruits. Of course, if the second wilderness lost its origin energy, it would not be far from destruction, because without the origin energy, no one would be able to break through to the saint realm. Even the spiritual chi in the heaven and earth would quickly disappear, and no one would be able to cultivate. Moreover, as time passed, the second wilderness environment would become more and more difficult to cultivate, and it would eventually become a land of death. It was no exaggeration to say that if the second wilderness will of the heavenly way saw the second wilderness origin energy being transferred to the seventh wilderness, the second wilderness would be destroyed even if they did nothing. Of course, it would take a long time, at least a few hundred years. Obviously, the will of the heavenly way did not want to wait that long. Therefore, after the seventh wilderness will of the heavenly way asked the second will of the heavenly way to transfer the second wilderness origin energy to the seventh wilderness, the second wilderness will of the heavenly way nodded. "Okay, then I'll do it right away." Due to the loss of the first battle, the will of the heavenly way did not intend to continue attacking, because their chances of winning were too low. The Hachibara Senkai's defense was almost perfect, and they had no chance of winning. In that case, they would rather die than live in dishonor. 8 Baron completely gave up on the second Baron and decided to destroy it. However, when the will of the heavenly way made this decision, it was clear that they did not consider the many living beings in the second wilderness. They did not care at all that all the living beings in the second wilderness would be wiped out because of their decision. It was not just a few tens of thousands of people, but billions of lives. Just like that, with just a few words from the wills of the heavenly ways, their fates had been decided. In the eyes of those at the top, the living beings at the bottom were probably just numbers. If they died, then they died. There was nothing to be concerned about. Perhaps the living beings in the second wilderness thought that their God, the will of the heavenly way, whom they worshipped and believed in, would definitely fight to the death with the Hachibara Senkai for them. However, who would have thought that their God, the person they worshipped, would abandon them without hesitation? He did not even leave them with the slightest chance of survival. In order to prevent the second wilderness from falling into the hands of the Hachibara Senkai, the will of the Heavenly Way decided to completely destroy the second wilderness. Compared to this, the so-called massacre of the city was child's play. Hearing the will of the Heavenly Way's words, the other will of the Heavenly Way nodded and went to make their own preparations. The task of the will of the Heavenly Way in the second wilderness was to transfer the origin energy of the second wilderness to the seventh wilderness. As the will of the Heavenly Way, he represented the heavens and earth. Therefore, this task was not difficult and no one could stop him, including Luo Li and the others. The origin energy was the power of the heavens and earth. Only the will of the Heavenly Way could control it. Of course, giving up the second wilderness was also a last resort for the will of the Heavenly Way. After all, no one wanted to give up the second wilderness. Once they gave up the second wilderness, it meant that the will of the Heavenly Way's control over the heavens and earth would weaken. After that, the second wilderness and the will of the Heavenly Way could only be entrusted to the seventh wilderness. Although at first glance, with the origin energy of the two wilderness, the seventh wilderness would undoubtedly become a treasure land, it was definitely not a good thing compared to normal circumstances. Although nothing could be seen in a short period of time, the will of the Heavenly Way of the two wilderness would condense in the seventh wilderness, which was equivalent to speeding up the consumption of the heavens and earth. One day, the seventh wilderness would decline after reaching its peak. But now, the will of the Heavenly Way obviously couldn't consider so much. Now that it was impossible to take back the second wilderness, they could only settle for the next best thing. As for the decline after reaching its peak, it would be at least hundreds of millions of years later. At that time, who knew what the situation of the eight wilderness would be like? Perhaps the outcome of the battle between the eight wilderness and the Hachibara Senkai would have already been decided by then. After arriving at his cave, the second wilderness will of the Heavenly Way began to communicate with the origin energy of the second wilderness. However, at the same time, he could clearly feel the true meaning emitted from the second wilderness will of the Heavenly Way, as well as the terrifying killing intent. Hachibara Senkai, one day, I will definitely make you pay the price. Having no choice but to give up on the second wilderness will of the Heavenly Way's feelings were understandable. It would be a lie to say that he didn't hate them. At this moment, the second wilderness will of the Heavenly Way hated Hachibara Senkai, especially the second realm in Yi Xian, to the bone. He vowed to take revenge. At the same time, while the second wasteland will of the Heavenly Way was trying to communicate with the origin energy of the second wasteland, within the second wasteland, none of the living beings knew that their doomsday was coming. The god they believed in was personally sending them to their deaths. Several days passed in a row, and the eight wastelands did not attack again. However, just when everyone thought that the eight wastelands were about to give up, a huge change suddenly occurred in the second wasteland. Originally, everything was normal, but on this day, in the second wasteland, the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky all disappeared at the same time. There was no longer the sun rising and setting, nor were there any more stars. The entire sky of the second wasteland seemed to be covered by an incomparably huge and boundless black cloth. The entire second wasteland fell into endless darkness. It was supposed to be early in the morning, when everything was recovering. However, on this day, the sun did not rise as usual. The entire second wasteland was still shrouded in darkness. Many of the creatures living in the second wasteland did not know what had happened. They all looked at the sky with puzzled expressions, at the place where the sun should have been. They did not know that there was no sun rising and setting, no sun, moon, and stars. This was all because the second wasteland will of the Heavenly Way had already transferred away the origin energy of the second wasteland. Now, in the second wasteland, the heavens and earth were dead, and there was no longer any origin energy. Please collect, please vote, please recommend. Chapter 1716. The entire second wasteland fell into endless darkness. As for the changes in the second wasteland, Luo Li and the other realm lords of the Hachibara Senkai naturally noticed it immediately. After passing through the entrance, Luo Li and the other realm lords immediately entered the second wasteland. Yi Xian was the first to speak as he looked at the endless darkness before him. The origin of heaven and earth disappeared? At Yi Xian's level, they were naturally able to sense the existence of the origin of heaven and earth. After sensing it for a bit, Yi Xian immediately discovered that the origin of heaven and earth in the second wasteland had disappeared. He wasn't the only one. The other realm lords were the same. Hearing Yi Xian's words, Qingyan said in a low voice. It didn't disappear, but someone purposely moved it. Someone moved away the origin of the second wasteland? Hearing this, everyone quickly had an answer in their hearts. There was no doubt that it was done by the will of the heavenly way in the second wasteland. Moreover, other than him, no one else had the ability to do so. After transferring the origin of the second wasteland, the first thing that Luo Li and the other realm lords thought of was that the 8 wastelands had already given up on the second wasteland. This was obviously giving up. Otherwise, how could the second wasteland will of the heavenly way transfer the origin of heaven and earth away? He never thought that the second wasteland will of the heavenly way would make such a decision. However, as he transferred the origin of the second wasteland, the fate of the entire second wasteland could be said to be sealed. He would rather exterminate all life in the second wasteland than let us obtain it. What a good method. Ning Su's eyes flashed with a faint chill as he spoke. The choice of the second wasteland was indeed unexpected to the realm lords, but even if they knew, what could they do? Similarly, they could not stop the second wasteland will of the heavenly way from transferring its origin energy. Now that the second wasteland had lost its origin energy, even if it did nothing, it would still quickly head towards destruction after a long period of accumulation. As a result, Luo Li and the other realm lords had to make a choice. Did they still need such a second wasteland? Was it still useful for the Hachibara Senkai? What would the 8 Desolation Immortal World want to do with a place like this? There wouldn't be any spiritual qi in the world. Luo Li and the others didn't want to see this result. At the same time, facing the numerous creatures in the second wilderness, Luo Li and the others could only sigh helplessly. Their god had given up on them. What they could do next was to wait for death. Just as the faces of the various sector lords turned ugly, Luo Li, who had been silent all this while, suddenly said indifferently, "Actually, it's not that there's no other way. Have you all forgotten that there's another way? There's still a way to save the second wilderness." The sector lords were taken aback. Then, Red Lotus was the first to return to her senses. She turned to Luo Li and said with uncertainty. "You mean, that's right." Red Lotus had apparently guessed what was on Luo Li's mind. Before she finished her sentence, Luo Li nodded in response. "Brother Luo Li, you. If that's the case, isn't the price a little too high?" Red Lotus was the first to react. Shortly after, the other realm lords also thought of the same thing. Among them, Swating looked at Luo Li hesitantly. As a matter of fact, Luo Li's solution wasn't complicated. It was to use the power of living beings to replace the origin energy of the second wilderness. All living beings in heaven and earth were born together. There was no distinction between the power of living beings and the origin energy of heaven and earth. It was just that they were different. And now, since the origin energy of the second wilderness had been transferred by the will of the heavenly way, the only way to save the second wilderness was to gather the power of living beings and use it to replace the origin energy. This was the only way to save the second wilderness. However, in order to use the power of living beings to replace the origin energy, there were 2 crucial issues that had to be resolved. Firstly, they had to gather enough power of living beings. In order to gather enough power of living beings to replace the origin energy, conservatively speaking, at least half of the living beings in the second wilderness would have to sacrifice their lives. In the second wilderness, more than half of the living beings would have to sacrifice their lives as the price. But this couldn't be helped. It was better than the second wilderness being wiped out and everyone dying. That was the first issue. The second issue was that the living beings in the second wilderness had to see the true face of the will of the heavenly way and no longer believe in it. Otherwise, even if they gathered the power of living beings, the Hachibara Senkai would reject them greatly. When that happened, no matter how powerful Luoli and the rest were, they wouldn't be able to utilize the power of living beings. Both issues were rather thorny, especially the second one. How were they going to let the living beings in the second wilderness see the true face of the will of the heavenly way? After all, they were loyal to the will of the heavenly way from the depths of their souls. They were loyal to the heavens and the earth. Therefore, it wasn't easy to make them change their view of the will of the heavenly way. Of course, Luoli and the rest could have ignored the second wilderness. They could have just looted all the resources in the second wilderness and left it to fend for itself. This wouldn't have affected Luoli and the rest too much. At most, it would have been a pity. After all, the Hachibara Senkai's foundation wasn't in the second wilderness, but in the first wilderness. Therefore, the destruction of the second wilderness wouldn't have affected the Hachibara Senkai too much. However, if Luoli and the rest chose to leave, the fate of the second wilderness would be sealed. On the other hand, if Luoli and the rest were willing to take action, there would still be a chance to save the second wilderness. Although they would have to pay a heavy price, they would still be able to save half of the living beings and pull the second wilderness back from the brink of destruction. They were all very clear about this. Therefore, after hearing Zhuting's words, the sector lords fell into deep thought. After a while, Luoli said faintly, "How about it? We might not succeed, but there's still a chance." Luoli asked them if they were going to do it. Hearing this, Yuao Chuan was the first to speak. *CK, let's do it. I'm not as cold-blooded as the will of the heavenly way. Since there's a chance, let's give it a try. We can't just watch all the people in this wasteland die, right? Yuao Chuan was the first to speak. The second wasteland will of the heavenly way could give up on the entire second wasteland, even at the cost of the billions of lives in the second wasteland, but Yuao Chuan couldn't do it. Since there was a chance, why not give it a try? Yi Xian also spoke up after hearing Yuao Chuan's words. Then let's give it a try. Since old Ghost Yu has already said so. Yi Xian also agreed. Soon after, Zhuting, Red Lotus, Ning Su, and Qingyan all spoke up, indicating that they could give it a try. At the very least, there was still a glimmer of hope if they tried their best. Please collect, please vote, recommend. Chapter 1717. In the end, Yi Xian, Ning Su, Qingyun, Yuao Chuan, Zhuting, Luoli, Red Lotus, and the 7 realm lords all decided to give it a try. Regardless of whether they succeeded or not, they had at least experienced it. Everyone said that the Hachibara Senkai was a thief, or rebel against the heavens and earth. However, as the Hachibara Senkai's realm lord, Luoli and the others, to be honest, were not as ruthless as the will of the heavenly way. At the very least, they could not directly slaughter all the living beings in the desolate land. Of course, the key to saving the second desolate land this time was not Luoli and the others, but the many creatures in the second desolate land. Whether or not they could be saved depended on the many creatures in the second desolate land, on themselves. If they still chose to be blindly loyal to the will of the heavenly way in the end, then even if Luoli and the others wanted to, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. The first thing to do was to change the views of the many creatures in the second desolate land towards the will of the heavenly way. After deciding on this point, Luoli looked down at the second desolate land. An invisible wave of energy spread out from his body and quickly spread to every corner of the second desolate land. After that, Luoli did not speak, but everyone in the second desolate land heard Luoli's voice. Everyone in the second desolate land, I am the realm lord of the 7th realm of the Hachibara Senkai, Luoli. Today, the second desolate land has undergone a huge change, and it is different from what you imagined. I can tell you with certainty that the second desolate land is on the verge of destruction, because the origin energy of the second desolate land has already been transferred by the will of the heavenly way. The heavens and earth have already died, and their origin energy has been lost. If this continues, the second desolate land will definitely perish. At that time, you can imagine what will happen to you. Now, all of you have been abandoned by your gods and your beliefs. The will of the heavenly Tao has abandoned all of you and even severed all of your lives. Could it be that all of you are still willing to be loyal to that so-called will of the heavenly Tao? Luo Li's words were just for the people of the second desolation. As for whether they believed it or not, that was up to them. As his voice faded, the martialists of the various races in the second desolate land were all stunned. The heavenly paths had sucked away the origin source of the second desolate land? How is this possible? Will of the heavenly way abandon them? Doubt, shock, disbelief, these were the first thoughts of many creatures in the second wilderness after hearing Luo Li's words. However, the second wilderness had indeed undergone a great change. Hence, many people were at a loss. They did not know if they should believe Luo Li's words. The will of the heavenly Tao has abandoned us? Some people were filled with doubt, and the faith in their hearts began to waver as they muttered to themselves. However, at the same time, many people did not care about Luo Li's words. After all, they had been loyal to the will of the heavenly way for so many years. How could a simple sentence from Luo Li change their loyalty? As the realm lord of a world, you're actually using such a crude tactic to sow discord. How laughable. Many people were certain that Luo Li was trying to sow discord. However, Luo Li's words had indeed planted a seed in the hearts of many creatures in the second wilderness, paving the way for the future. With that, Luo Li and the others did not stay in the second wilderness for long. Luo Li still needed to make some preparations in order to save the second wilderness. Of course, the most important thing was to convince the creatures in the second wilderness at the same time. They left the second wilderness. However, due to the sudden changes in Luo Li's words, the second wilderness was not peaceful at the moment. On the various continents, powerful forces gathered together to discuss the great changes in the second wilderness and what Luo Li had said before. They did not believe that the will of the heavenly way would abandon them, but how could this sudden change be explained? Moreover, the great sage vaguely felt that something was different now that their origin energy had been sucked away. They did not care about the chaos in the second wilderness. Or perhaps, this was not the most important thing in Luo Li's eyes. After returning to the palace at the entrance of the second wilderness, Luo Li and the others had a discussion. In the end, they decided to let the young geniuses of the seven worlds enter the second wilderness while they were preparing. They would try to convince the people of the second wilderness so that they could see the true face of the will of the heavens. The task of convincing the creatures in the second wilderness was given to the young geniuses from the seven worlds. As for the other strong cultivators from the seven worlds, they were still guarding the place in case of a sudden attack from the 8 worlds. After the decision was made, Luo Li and the others quickly sent messages to Xiao Chen and the other heirs, telling them the truth about what had happened in the second wilderness. They also asked Xiao Chen and the others to lead the young geniuses from the different worlds into the second wilderness immediately. They would try to convince the creatures in the second wilderness to see the true face of the will of the heavenly way so that they could save themselves. Luo Li and the others even told Xiao Chen and the other heirs about using the power of living beings to replace the origin energy without any reservation. At this moment, Xiao Chen was drinking with the wine Taoist and Li Qiu in his cave residence when he suddenly received Luo Li's message. He was clearly stunned. He had never thought that such a huge change would happen in the second wilderness. Moreover, the will of the heavenly way in the second wilderness was so ruthless that it wanted to kill all the creatures in the second wilderness. Seeing Xiao Chen's stunned expression, Li Qiu asked curiously, "Xiao Chen, what happened?" Not knowing that it was a message from Luo Li, Xiao Chen didn't hide anything. He said plainly, "Something happened in the second wilderness. The will of the heavenly way took away the origin energy of the second wilderness. Now, the second wilderness is dead and the origin energy has dried up. The Realm Lord wants me to lead people into the second wilderness," he told Li Qiu and the wine Taoist about the contents of Luo Li's message. Hearing this, Li Qiu's expression darkened, but the wine Taoist said somewhat angrily, "The will of the heavenly way in the second wilderness wants to kill all the creatures in the wilderness?" The wine Taoist had officially joined the seventh world and become a member of the seventh world, but he still didn't hate the eighth wilderness. However, this time, hearing that the will of the heavenly way in the second wilderness wanted to kill all the creatures in the second wilderness, the wine Taoist was indeed somewhat angry. Those were the creatures in the wilderness. There were billions of lives in the wilderness, and they were going to be killed just like that? This couldn't be described with the word cruel anymore. A glint of anger flashed in his eyes. Upon hearing the wine Taoist's words, Li Qiu took a sip of wine and said in an ice-cold tone, "The will of the heavenly way is like this. In their eyes, what are the lives of all living beings worth?" Li Qiu saw the true colors of the will of the heavenly way more clearly. Upon hearing these words, the wine Taoist pondered in silence for a few moments, before looking at Xiaochen with a complicated expression. "Xiaochen, does the Realm Lord really have a way to save the second wilderness?" After this incident, the wine Taoist had seen through the will of the heavenly way completely. At that moment, what he was concerned about was whether Luoli and the others could really save the second wilderness. Please collect, vote, recommend. Chapter 17-18. Wine Taoist couldn't agree with the way the second wilderness will of the heavenly way did things. Even though the 8 barons and Achibara Senkai were at war with each other, the creatures in the second wilderness were innocent. Besides, even if there were many warriors in the second wilderness, there were still many ordinary people without cultivation. Wasn't the grandpa will of the heavenly way let them off? He was completely disappointed in the will of the heavenly way. The little bit of good impression he had of the 8 barons vanished completely. What else could the wine Taoist say if he could slaughter all the living beings in the wilderness without any hesitation? Wine Taoist wasn't willing to consider anything related to the 8 barons anymore. Besides, even if he were to meet powerful beings from the 8 barons in the future, he wouldn't be soft-hearted anymore. At that moment, the only thing he was concerned about was whether Luoli's group could save the second wilderness. Upon hearing wine Taoist's words, Xiaochen took a sip of wine and said indifferently, "I'm not 100% confident because it depends on whether the people in the second wilderness can see the true colors of the will of the heavenly way. If they continue to be foolishly loyal to the will of the heavenly way, there's nothing the Realm Master and the rest can do." The most crucial thing was still up to the second wilderness. If the people in the second wilderness were willing to believe in the will of the heavenly way until their deaths, there was nothing Luoli's group could do. Wine Taoist let out a sigh and muttered softly, "Foolishly loyal, the survival of the second wilderness was in their hands. If they were willing to save themselves, there was still a chance of survival. But if they weren't, they would only be digging their own graves." At this point, Xiaochen paused as if he was hesitating, but in the end, he still said, "Moreover, even if we succeed in the end, we will have to pay a huge price. At least half of the creatures in the second wilderness will die. It was impossible to save the entire second wilderness." Wine Taoist nodded slightly. "It's good enough that we can save half of them. But, sigh, half of them surviving was already the best outcome." Wine Taoist was naturally aware of this. However, whether or not they could succeed in the end still depended on second desolation. Wine Taoist didn't know what to say and couldn't intervene in this matter. Then, Xiaochen finished the wine in his cup in one gulp and bid farewell to Wine Taoist and Li Qiu. Time was of the essence and Luoli's group's command was for Xiaochen to lead the young geniuses from the 7th realm into the second wilderness and Resolve's group immediately. After bidding farewell to Wine Taoist and Li Qiu, Xiaochen sent a message to Yu Shujin, asking her to gather all the young geniuses of the 7th realm at the main square. Prepare to enter the second wilderness immediately. Xiaochen instructed Luan Luan. But for some reason, Hong Xiu heard about it and quickly found Xiaochen. Not only that, but Hong Xiu also wanted to go with Xiaochen. Xiaochen didn't reject Hong Xiu's request. After all, the mighty beings above the immortal stage in the second wilderness had evacuated with the second wilderness will of the heavenly way. At this moment, the strongest being in the second wilderness was only the great sage. With Hong Xiu's strength and background, she shouldn't be in any danger even without Xiaochen's protection. Since there was no danger and Hong Xiu insisted on going with him, Xiaochen agreed in the end. Luan Luan personally walked Xiaochen out of the cave. Before they parted, the little girl looked at Xiaochen with a face full of reluctance and said, "Daddy, you have to come back soon. Otherwise, Luan Luan will miss you. Okay, Daddy will be back soon. Luan Luan must be obedient, especially Grandmaster. Do you understand? Upon hearing this, Xiaochen gently rubbed the little girl's head. Then, he turned and left with Hong Xiu. With Wine Daoist and a few maids taking care of Luan Luan, Xiaochen wasn't too worried about Luan Luan's safety since they were in the 7th realm. He brought Hong Xiu all the way to the main square. At this moment, many young geniuses from the 7th realm had already gathered and were waiting. Without wasting any time, Xiaochen told them about Luo Li's order. Then, he ordered them to enter the 2nd wilderness. Upon hearing Xiaochen's words, everyone's expression changed slightly. No one had expected the 2nd wilderness will of the heavenly way to be so cruel. It was willing to sacrifice the entire 2nd wilderness to prevent the Hachibara Senkai from obtaining it. Xiaochen didn't care about what these geniuses were thinking. There wasn't much time left. Xiaochen led the people from the 7th realm to the entrance of the 2nd wilderness. While Xiaochen and the others were moving, 8 desolates had successfully extracted the origin energy from the 2nd wilderness. The 2nd wilderness will of the heavenly way and the 7th wilderness will of the heavenly way join forces to forcibly integrate the origin energy that originally belonged to the 2nd wilderness into the 7th wilderness. With the integration of the origin energy, the 2nd wilderness will of the heavenly way could clearly feel that its connection with the 2nd wilderness was completely severed. Instead, it was closely connected to the 7th wilderness. At this moment, the 2nd wilderness will of the heavenly way had nothing to do with the 2nd wilderness. To put it simply, the 2nd wilderness will of the heavenly way had already become the 7th wilderness will of the heavenly way. In other words, the 7th wilderness already had 2 will of the heavenly way. After completely integrating the origin energy into the 7th wilderness, the 2nd wilderness will of the heavenly way slowly opened its eyes. There was no special expression in its eyes as it looked at the other will of the heavenly way around it. The 2nd wilderness will of the heavenly way said indifferently, "All right." Hearing this, the 3rd wilderness will of the heavenly way indifferently said, "Then let's begin. I reckon that Yi Xian and the others won't just watch as the 2nd wilderness is destroyed, so we have to hurry." He guessed that Yi Xian and the other realm masters wouldn't just watch as the 2nd wilderness was destroyed. As a result, it was urgent to destroy the 2nd wilderness as soon as possible. Hearing the words of the 3rd wilderness will of the heavenly way, the rest of the will of the heavenly way nodded in agreement. Following which, the few of them directly sat down in the main hall, closed their eyes, and began their final action, destroying the 2nd wilderness. Actually, the way for the few will of the heavenly way to destroy the 2nd wilderness was very simple. It was to speed up the destruction of the 2nd wilderness. Originally, without the origin energy, even if the 2nd wilderness was left alone, it would still be destroyed after 100 years. At this moment, the actions of the few will of the heavenly way would only speed up the destruction of the 2nd wilderness, making it only take a few months or even a month for the 2nd wilderness to be destroyed. He didn't give the 2nd wilderness any chance of survival at all. Not only did he take away the origin energy, he even personally sped up the destruction of the 2nd wilderness. Request collection, request monthly votes, request recommendation. Chapter 1719. The will of the heavenly way had already started. Xiaochen and the others had also entered the 2nd wasteland. Not only Xiaochen, but Guanhong, Fu Rui, Quan Feng, Qiu Ru, Lu Xiao, and Yi Xiao had also led the young geniuses from various realms into the 2nd wasteland. As soon as they entered the 2nd wasteland, they saw that the entire place was shrouded in darkness. There was no light at all. 7 starships were docked together. Xiaochen, Guanhong, and the other heirs of Kunlun gathered on the deck of one of the starships. They had all received Luo Li's message and understood the purpose of entering the 2nd wasteland. Like the 7th wasteland, there were many continents in the 2nd wasteland. However, only 7 continents were truly large. These 7 continents were the foundation of the 2nd wasteland. Xiaochen and the others' primary goal was naturally these 7 continents. Looking at Xiaochen and the others, Guanhong took the lead and said, let's each take one continent. It'll be faster this way. Guanhong suggested that each of them take one continent and act separately. This would be more efficient. Hearing this, no one had any objections. This was indeed a good idea. Seeing this, Guanhong continued, then let's do it. There's no time to lose. This time, their mission in the seventh wasteland was to expose the true nature of the will of the Heavenly Way and make the creatures in the second wasteland no longer loyal to the will of the Heavenly Way. This was the only way that Luoli and the others could use the power of living beings gathered by the creatures in the second wasteland to save the second wasteland. Hearing Guanhong's words, Xiaochen and the others nodded. Then they split up and headed for the 7 largest continents in the second wasteland. Xiaochen had already learned about the situation in the second wasteland from the information in the Hachibara Senkai. Xiaochen chose a continent called the Human Emperor Continent. Although the second wasteland and the seventh wasteland were both made up of 7 main continents, there were actually some differences between them. In the seventh wasteland, hundreds of races lived on the same continent. In the second wasteland, there were 7 powerful races in total. These 7 powerful races ruled the 7 main continents in the second wasteland. This way, there were obviously fewer conflicts in the second wasteland than in the seventh wasteland. The Human Emperor Continent that Xiaochen chose was one of the continents notified by the human tribe. The human tribe was very powerful in the second wasteland. They were no weaker than the deity tribe, demon tribe, or ghost tribe. Therefore, the human tribe had always ruled the Human Emperor Continent. They had fallen into darkness. There was not even a faint light from the stars in the starry sky. The starship that Xiaochen and the others were on was traveling through the darkness, flying toward Runhuang Continent. On the starship, Xiaochen was thinking about how to stop the people on the Human Emperor Continent from believing in the will of the Heavenly Way. Their mission in the second wasteland was to let the people of the second wasteland see the true face of the will of the Heavenly Way. They wanted to stop believing in the will of the Heavenly Way. To do this, it was impossible to rely solely on force. But was there any other way? They couldn't think of any way to stop the people of the second wasteland from believing in the will of the Heavenly Way. After so many years, the will of the Heavenly Way had penetrated deeply into the souls of the people. That kind of innate loyalty couldn't be changed so easily. The starship headed towards the Human Emperor Continent. At the same time, in the main hall of the Human Emperor sect, the only great sage sect on the Human Emperor Continent, 18 of the great sages had gathered together. The great sages gathered in the main hall. These people were all experts of the Human Emperor sect. At this moment, one of them spoke. We still don't have any clues about the great changes in the second wasteland. However, Luoli, the realm lord of the 7th realm of the Hachibara Senkai, said that it was the doing of the will of the Heavenly Way. The experts of the Human Emperor sect had naturally investigated the sudden changes in the second wasteland. Unfortunately, they didn't have any clues so far. No one knew why the second wasteland suddenly became like this overnight. However, Luoli's words were heard by many experts of the Human Emperor sect. According to Luoli, the reason the second wasteland became like this was entirely because of the will of the Heavenly Way. It was the will of the Heavenly Way that transferred the origin energy of the second wasteland. That was why the second wasteland had such a great change. Moreover, without the origin energy, the second wasteland would soon fall and perish. Hearing this person's words, the rest of the experts of the Human Emperor sect sneered. Ha, Hachibara Senkai bastard. Do you think we'll fall for such a childish trick of sowing discord? In my opinion, the great changes in the second wasteland must be a trick of the Hachibara Senkai. They actually want to blame the will of the Heavenly Way. That's right. I think the great changes this time must have something to do with the Hachibara Senkai. If it weren't for them, how could the second wasteland become like this? They all felt that the great changes in the second wasteland must be a trick of the Hachibara Senkai. The Hachibara Senkai must have done something to the second wasteland, causing the great changes in the second wasteland. The great sage of the Human Emperor sect spoke one after another in the main hall. Their words were full of hatred for the Hachibara Senkai and their trust in the will of the Heavenly Way. Clearly, they did not listen to Luo Li's words, nor did they doubt the will of the heavenly way. They did not believe that the will of the heavenly way would abandon them because it was their God and their faith. How could it abandon them? It had to be said that the great sage of the human emperor sect were still so loyal to the will of the heavenly way in the second wasteland. They did not doubt it at all. It would be very difficult for Xiaochen to make them see the true face of the will of the heavenly way. Because of their soul-deep loyalty to the will of the heavenly way, these people of the human emperor sect had lost the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. They did not even think about it. If the Hachibara Senkai had the power to cause such a great change in the second wasteland, why had the Hachibara Senkai not used it for such a long time? It had not been used before, and now that the second wasteland had fallen into the hands of the Hachibara Senkai, what purpose did the Hachibara Senkai have to cause such a great change in the second wasteland? To cause the sun and moon to lose their light and the stars to fall? Just thinking about it casually was enough to find all sorts of suspicious points. Unfortunately, these people of the human emperor sect had never thought of it this way. They were instinctively willing to believe that the will of the heavenly way had not abandoned them. They had never thought that in fact, it was the will of the heavenly way in their hearts that had personally destroyed them and pushed them to a dead end. Please add, please vote, please recommend. Chapter 1720. The great sage of the human emperor sect all agreed that the great changes in the second wilderness were caused by the Hachibara Senkai. They didn't doubt the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness at all. Judging from the attitude of the 18 the great sage, it wouldn't be easy to make them see the true face of the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness. It couldn't be helped. Some things were hard to change once they were ingrained in one's soul. Moreover, Xiaochen was also quite helpless about this mission. Xiaochen didn't know about the human emperor sect. Inside the starship, he was a little annoyed. This was because until now, Xiaochen didn't have a good way to convince the people of the human emperor continent. He didn't even have the slightest confidence. Xiaochen probably wouldn't be so annoyed even if Xiaochen were to massacre the entire human emperor continent. However, Xiaochen really didn't have the confidence to convince the people of the human emperor continent. She wasn't good at these things. Seeing that Xiaochen was a little annoyed, Hongxiu slowly walked behind Xiaochen and gently massaged his shoulders. What's wrong? Are you still thinking of a way? Don't worry. Let's see how it goes first. She guessed that Xiaochen was annoyed by the situation of the human emperor continent. Hearing Hongxiu's words, Xiaochen closed his eyes and sighed softly. I can kill people, but convincing the people of the human emperor continent to stop believing in the will of the heavenly way? I really don't know where to start. As someone from the seventh wilderness, Xiaochen knew what the will of the heavenly way represented in the eyes of all living beings. Take Xiaochen for example. Before he refined the force of all living beings, no, even after he refined the force of all living beings, Xiaochen didn't say that he didn't want to believe in the will of the heavenly way of the seventh wilderness. It was only after the will of the heavenly way of the seventh wilderness killed Qin Shuru and the others in front of him that Xiaochen truly saw the true face of the seventh wilderness. Even he was like this back then, let alone others. Xiaochen could imagine how loyal the people of the human emperor continent were to the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness. In the face of a group of people who were almost fanatically loyal to the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness, it was easier said than done to make them see the true face of the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness. Moreover, given Xiaochen's character, asking Xiaochen to do this was more difficult than asking Zhang Fei to do embroidery. That was why Xiaochen was so upset along the way. Seeing Xiaochen's upset look, Hongxiu, who was massaging Xiaochen, laughed. This is the first time I've seen you like this. It was indeed the first time Hongxiu had seen Xiaochen like this. He was a little helpless and a little conflicted. Hongxiu always felt that he was very cute. Who would have thought that Xiaochen, who was like the god of slaughter in the eyes of the young geniuses of the seventh realm, actually had such a side to him? At that moment, Xiaochen was like a little wife who had been wronged. Even his scarlet eyes were filled with grievances. Xiaochen rolled his eyes at Hongxiu when she thought that he was cute. He cursed in his mind, what the F***ck is going on here? Xiaochen was indeed helpless, but he had no other choice. Not only because of Luo Li's orders, but also because Xiaochen didn't want to see the second wilderness perish just like that. However, in order to save the second wilderness, one of the conditions was to let the people of the second wilderness see the true face of the will of the heavenly way and make them no longer believe in the will of the heavenly way. That was F***ket up. But there was no other choice. This was the only way to save the second wilderness. Xiaochen and the others arrived at the Runhuang continent half a day later as the starship continued to fly. Looking at the huge continent below, the helplessness in Xiaochen's eyes deepened, but he still ordered Yu Shujin to land. No matter the result, he had to give it a try. However, it was indeed difficult for Xiaochen to persuade the people. Because the purpose of this trip was to persuade the people of the human emperor continent, Xiaochen and the others didn't conceal their aura. In fact, Xiaochen deliberately released his aura so that the powerhouses of the human emperor continent could detect their arrival immediately. The aura of the immortal realm soon spread out from Xiaochen's body. This aura didn't bring any pressure to people, but as long as one's cultivation reached the great sage realm, one would be able to detect it immediately no matter where one was in the human emperor continent. Xiaochen deliberately released his aura with the purpose of attracting the great sage of the human emperor continent to come. After all, it was Xiaochen's first time in the human emperor continent. It was too troublesome for him to find the great sage of the human emperor continent. It was better for them to come to him. As Xiaochen's aura spread out, the great sage of the human emperor sect soon felt it. For a moment, figures soared into the sky. The aura of the immortal realm. Is the powerhouse of the second wilderness here? The great sage stood proudly in the sky above the human emperor sect, looking at the source of the aura. One of them said, "I don't know, but let's go and take a look. After all, it's a immortal realm powerhouse who has come." Hearing this, another person said. Based on the aura, no one could tell who it was for the time being. However, it was a immortal realm powerhouse who had come. Judging from the aura, there was no hostility. Therefore, the great sage of the human emperor sect decided to go and take a look first. After a discussion, the great sage of the human emperor sect decided to send 8 people to meet this mysterious immortal realm powerhouse. As for the others, they would stay in the human emperor sect for the time being until they could confirm the identity of this immortal realm powerhouse. After making the decision, 8 of the great sage of the human emperor sect tore through the void and headed in the direction of Xiaochen. As for the remaining 10, they remained in the human emperor sect. The great sage's speed was not slow. Therefore, in less than an hour after Xiaochen released his aura, the great sage of the human emperor sect appeared in front of Xiaochen and the others. At first, they thought that it was a immortal realm powerhouse from the second wilderness who had come. However, when the great sage arrived in front of the starship where Xiaochen and the others were, they realized that they were wrong. Judging from the black starship in front of them, the newcomer was not a immortal realm powerhouse from the second wilderness. Instead, it was a immortal realm powerhouse from the Hachibara Senkai. The great sage's faces darkened at the unexpected arrival of the Hachibara Senkai. However, at this time, Xiaochen had already appeared in front of them and said indifferently, "Are you all the great sage of the human emperor continent? Please collect, vote, recommend." Chapter 1721. The great sage's faces darkened when they heard Xiaochen's words. On the other hand, Xiaochen did not know what to say, so his expression was a little strange. Indeed, Xiaochen did not know how to persuade people. Xiaochen did not answer Xiaochen's question. Hearing this, one of the great sage immediately shouted angrily. "Thieves of the Hachibara Senkai, what are you doing in the human emperor continent?" In fact, ever since the second wilderness fell into the hands of the Hachibara Senkai, the people of the Hachibara Senkai had never entered the second wilderness. Only at the very beginning, when a great battle broke out in the second wilderness. Then, because of the formation, they stayed in the second wilderness. Because of the counterattack from the 8 wilderness, basically no one from the Hachibara Senkai had entered the second wilderness. At this moment, seeing Xiao Chen and the others in front of them, the great sage of the human emperor sect naturally felt a little angry. Especially now that the responsibility of the great changes in the second wilderness was all pinned on the Hachibara Senkai, their hatred was naturally even stronger. In the eyes of the 8 of them, the great changes in the second wilderness were definitely caused by the Hachibara Senkai. They wanted to destroy the entire second wilderness. The anger in their eyes was not concealed at all. Facing the anger of the 8 people, Xiao Chen was helpless. What the F***ck was this? When they met, it was as if they had met their father's murderer. How was he going to persuade them? They hated the Hachibara Senkai to the core, so it was not easy to persuade the people of the second wilderness. Xiao Chen felt helpless, but there was nothing he could do. He could only patiently say, the second desolate will of the heavenly way transfer the second desolate's origin energy away. Without the second desolate's origin energy, it will soon fall. However, we have a way to save the second desolate. He really didn't know what to say, so Xiao Chen could only speak bluntly. However, after hearing Xiao Chen's words, the great sage of the human emperor sect didn't listen to him at all, and shouted angrily without hesitation. Bullsh*T, it's clearly your Hachibara Senkai that wants to destroy the second wilderness, and you're actually accusing the will of the heavenly way. That's right. Everyone says that you people from the Hachibara Senkai are a bunch of thieves. Today, I see that it's true. You dare to do it, but you don't dare to admit it. To think that you're a mighty immortal. Why are you wasting your breath on him? Even if we can't win today, we'll fight the thieves of the Hachibara Senkai to the death. The 8 of them shouted angrily one after another. As soon as they finished speaking, before Xiao Chen could reply, the 8 of them had already made their moves. In their opinion, there was nothing to talk about with the thieves of the Hachibara Senkai. Since Xiao Chen and the others dared to come to the human emperor continent, they could only fight. No matter what the outcome was, all the warriors in the human emperor continent might bow down to the Hachibara Senkai. The 8 of them attacked at the same time, directly attacking Xiao Chen. Seeing this, Xiao Chen's eyes flashed with a hint of coldness. These guys were a bunch of mad dogs. They worshipped the will of the heavenly way almost to the point of morbid. They wouldn't listen to you at all. How could you negotiate like this? They didn't give Xiao Chen any chance to speak at all. As the 8 of the great sage attacked at the same time, Xiao Chen's face turned cold. A bunch of idiots. You don't even know that you're about to die. In Xiao Chen's opinion, these 8 the great sage of the human emperor sect were really idiots. They didn't know anything. They only knew that they were blindly loyal to the will of the heavenly way. Little did they know that the second wilderness had already abandoned them long ago. Looking at the current situation, it was impossible to get these 8 to talk peacefully. However, since they wanted to fight, Xiao Chen naturally wasn't afraid. Not to mention the 8 of them, even if the entire human emperor sect gathered their strength, they wouldn't be enough in front of Xiao Chen. Xiao Chen didn't even use the dustless sword. Facing the 8's attack, he gently slapped out with his palm and immediately blasted the 2 people in front of him away. After that, Xiao Chen didn't stop there. He pointed out a few times in succession and instantly disintegrated the 8's attack. In front of Xiao Chen, the 8 the great sage didn't have the slightest ability to fight back. They were easily defeated by Xiao Chen. He didn't kill the 8 of them. After all, he didn't come to the human emperor continent to kill them this time. He came to persuade them, and this was what made Xiao Chen the most aggrieved. With Xiao Chen's current character, he would definitely try his best not to talk nonsense if he could fight. However, Xiao Chen came to the human emperor continent this time to talk nonsense. If he wanted to persuade the people of the human emperor continent, he naturally couldn't kill them right away. However, the 8 the great sage didn't appreciate Xiao Chen's mercy at all. The 8 of them were sent flying, but they quickly went straight for Xiao Chen. It was as if they didn't care about their lives at all. A group of mad dogs. They knew they were no match for Xiao Chen, but they still wanted to die. Looking at the 8 of them, the coldness in Xiao Chen's eyes deepened. With a cold snort, Xiao Chen took a step forward and suddenly appeared in front of one of them. His right hand formed a palm and directly imprinted on the person's dantian. Then, vigorous spiritual energy gushed out from his palm and instantly sealed the person's cultivation. Since he couldn't kill them, and the 8 of them were like mad dogs who didn't fear death, Xiaochen could only seal their cultivation. Only then would he have a chance to talk things out slowly. With Xiaochen's strength, it wasn't difficult to seal the cultivation of the 8 people. Then, he followed the same pattern. Soon, the 8 people's cultivation was sealed one by Xiaochen. Without their cultivation, the 8 of them were like ordinary people at this time. With a casual toss, the 8 of them were directly thrown onto the deck of the starship. Then, Xiaochen slowly landed in front of the 8 of them. Unfortunately, even though their cultivation was sealed and their movements were restricted, the 8 of them still looked at Xiaochen and shouted angrily. "Bastard of the Hachibara Senkai, kill us if you dare. If this old man frowns, I'm not a warrior of the second wilderness." They were still cursing recklessly. Hearing this, the coldness in Xiaochen's eyes grew even colder. He looked down at the 8 people in front of him and said coldly, "A bunch of idiots. Are your brains filled with sh*t? Think about the great change in the second wilderness. Other than the second wilderness will of the heavenly way, who else could have done it? Moreover, it hasn't even been a day since the great change happened. As the great sage, can't you feel that the spiritual energy between heaven and earth is quickly disappearing? You don't know that you're about to die, and in the end, you still want to pledge your loyalty to the person who personally sent you on your way. Will of the heavenly way? Ha, open your dog eyes and take a good look. Use your brains and think about it. Other than the second wilderness will of the heavenly way, who else could have done it? Please add, please vote, please recommend." Chapter 1722. Xiaochen scolded. The 8 great saint emperors of the human emperor sect had different expressions on their faces. A sliver of surprise flashed through the eyes of 2 out of the 8 when they heard Xiaochen's words. Clearly, they felt that Xiaochen's words made some sense. Although they did not completely believe Xiaochen's words, they would at least consider the various points of doubt. However, apart from the 2 of them, the other 6 did not believe Xiaochen at all. One of them even yelled out angrily, "Bullshit. Do you think you can make us doubt the heavenly ways with just a few words? Impossible. The heavenly ways will never abandon us. We're all subjects of the heavenly ways." The 6 of them still did not believe Xiaochen. Xiaochen could not be bothered to pay attention to them. He looked at the great sages' expressions. He could tell that the 2 of them were clearly more meticulous. As a result, Xiaochen only planned to talk to the 2 of them. Xiaochen did not even want to pay attention to the other 6 idiots. Xiaochen said indifferently when he looked at the 2 of them. "The 2 of you aren't completely idiotic. Think carefully about what I just said. If it's as you said, the great changes in the second wilderness really were caused by my Hachibara Senkai, then why hasn't the Hachibara Senkai done anything during all this time? Now that the second wilderness has been taken over by the Hachibara Senkai, what would the Hachibara Senkai gain from destroying the second wilderness? Also, as the great sage, even if you don't understand, you should have heard that origin energy can only be controlled by the will of the heavenly way. Apart from the will of the heavenly way, no one else can control origin energy. Even the world lords of my Hachibara Senkai cannot take away the origin energy of the second wilderness. Think about it carefully. Now, scram. In 3 days, I will personally come to the human emperor sect." After berating them, Xiaochen waved his hand, and the sealed powers of the 8 people in front of him were restored to their original state. Although the 6 of them were still glaring at Xiaochen angrily, they did not continue to attack. It was impossible for him to be a match for Xiaochen. Besides Xiaochen, there were hundreds of young geniuses from the 7th realm around. The 6 of them snorted coldly and left. As for the 2, the great sage, who had strange expressions on their faces, they took a deep look at Xiaochen before they left. Their gazes were somewhat complicated and conflicted. Xiaochen didn't make things difficult for the 8 of them. After all, he didn't come to the human emperor continent to kill. He had his own considerations as to why he would head to the human emperor sect 3 days later. Judging from the expressions of the two great sages, they obviously listened to Xiao Chen's words and had doubts about the second wilderness. Therefore, they would definitely discuss it among themselves when they returned to the human emperor sect. Xiao Chen gave them enough time to discuss before heading to the human emperor sect. In this way, it should be easier to persuade them. After all, the warriors on the human emperor continent were probably hostile to him. If he went to the human emperor sect at this time, he wouldn't be able to sit down and have a good talk. It was better to give the human emperor sect some time to recover. After letting the great sage of the human emperor sect go, Xiao Chen sighed softly and then turned to walk into the starship. The mission this time was indeed tricky. It wasn't that Xiao Chen wasn't good at it. After escaping from Xiao Chen, the great sage quickly returned to the human emperor sect. Following their return, the other 10 the great sage of the human emperor sect also appeared in the main hall. Everyone gathered together. How is it? What's the situation? One of them looked at the 8 great sages and asked. Hearing this, a middle-aged man among the 8 great sages said coldly, they are not experts from the second wilderness. They are from the Hachibara Senkai. And the leader should be one of the Hachibara Senkai's heirs. Upon hearing this, the other 10 great saint emperors present were stunned. They had also heard of the heirs of the 8 desolation immortal world. It was said that they were all existences who had condensed heavenly immortal mansions. Each of the heirs of the 8 desolation immortal world was comparable to an immortal venerable. They didn't expect that one of the Hachibara Senkai's heirs would come in person. Their faces turned ugly. Then, the man who spoke before asked, why has the Hachibara Senkai come? Humph, a bunch of thieves. What good can they do? They just want to sow discord between us and the will of the heavenly way. Of the 8 great sages who went to see Xiao Chen, 2 of them didn't say a word. However, the other 6 angrily recounted what had happened. During the whole process, the 6 of them insisted that Xiao Chen had come to sow discord. What did they mean by the will of the heavenly way was the cause of the great change in the second wilderness? That was bullshit. How could the will of the heavenly way do such a thing? After the 6 great sages recounted what had happened, the other 10 great sages fell silent. However, anger flashed in many of their eyes. Obviously, they thought the same as the 6 great sages. Xiao Chen's words were bullshit. The will of the heavenly way would never do such a thing. What a joke. The will of the heavenly way was the protector of the second wilderness. Would he kill the second wilderness? It was simply impossible. The great sages of the human emperor sect mostly believed that the will of the heavenly way wouldn't do such a thing. What Xiao Chen had said before was simply nonsense. It was slander. He wanted to sow discord between them and the will of the heavenly way. However, some people believed that the will of the heavenly way in the second wilderness, while others fell into a dilemma. The most conflicted were the 2 great sages who had gone with them. They were different from the other 6 great sages. After careful consideration, they felt that Xiao Chen's words weren't unreasonable. Seeing that the 2 great sages were silent, a white-haired old man sitting on the main seat said, "What's wrong? Why aren't you saying anything?" This white-haired old man was the oldest and most powerful the great sage in the human emperor sect. His cultivation had almost reached the half-step immortal realm. Unfortunately, he hadn't had the opportunity to break through to the immortal realm. Having lived for so many years, the white-haired old man had also sensed the strangeness of the 2 of them and had gone together. However, after returning, the 2 of them did not say a single word and their faces were filled with contemplation. This caused the white-haired old man to become curious. However, after hearing the white-haired old man's words, the other 6 great sages who had gone with him to Xiao Chen all snorted coldly. Humph, what's wrong with the 2 of them? They've been misled. After hearing the words of that scum Hachibara Senkai, they've actually begun to doubt the will of the heavenly way. Sigh, the 2 of you are still not mentally strong enough. How can you doubt the will of the heavenly way just because of a few words from that scum Hachibara Senkai? Please add, Please vote, please recommend. Chapter 1723. The two of them doubted the will of the heavenly way because of Xiao Chen's words. Naturally, they were criticized by the others. In their hearts, the will of the heavenly way was unquestionable. The two of them did not refute the criticism of the crowd. To be honest, they were in a mess. It was not that they believed Xiao Chen, but they felt that Xiao Chen's words were not without reason. Since that was the case, what about the will of the heavenly way? Therefore, the two of them were at a loss. Unlike the others, the white-haired old man looked at the two of them and asked calmly, "What do the two of you think?" Compared to the criticism of the others, the white-haired old man was more willing to listen to the thoughts of the two of them. This was because the two of them were his disciples, and they were his most outstanding disciples. They had shown great talent since they were young, and they were meticulous. Therefore, the white-haired old man believed that the two of them must have their own ideas. In the face of the white-haired old man's question, the two of them were silent for a moment before they finally spoke. "Master, junior brother, and I feel that the Hachibara Senkai's words are not baseless. First of all, based on the current situation, the Hachibara Senkai has no reason to attack the second desolate land." How can there be no reason? The Hachibara Senkai has always wanted to destroy the second desolate land. Isn't that a reason? The two of them opened their mouths, but they were interrupted by the others. Obviously, they were furious that the two of them doubted the will of the heavenly way. However, the two of them did not show any signs of anger. After a pause, they continued to speak at a steady pace. "That's right. The Hachibara Senkai has always wanted to destroy the second desolate land. However, that was in the past. Now, the second desolate land has been conquered by the Hachibara Senkai. With the power of the Hachibara Senkai, it will not take long for them to completely control the second desolate land. Therefore, is there a need to destroy the second desolate land?" Hearing this, the white-haired old man in the lead also fell into deep thought. It had to be said that what his two disciples said was not unreasonable. Indeed, did the Hachibara Senkai have any reason to destroy the second wilderness? Obviously not. This was like a cultivator who had finally obtained the treasure he wanted after painstaking efforts. But after obtaining the treasure, who would destroy it? Perhaps there was no such person in this world. It was the same for the second wilderness. After expending so much effort, Hachibara Senkai had finally taken down the second wilderness. But after that, would the Hachibara Senkai destroy the second wilderness? It was impossible. Since they had no motive to attack, then perhaps the great changes in the second wilderness really had nothing to do with Hachibara Senkai. The white-haired old man fell into deep thought. The two beside him continued, "Also, although we don't know who that Hachibara Senkai's heir is, his strength is definitely enough to kill us instantly. But he didn't do so. Instead, he let us go. I'm thinking that if the Hachibara Senkai really wanted to sow discord, they could have killed us all if they didn't succeed. Moreover, with that person's strength, if he wanted to attack, our human emperor sect wouldn't be able to stop him at all." It was also very strange that Xiao Chen didn't kill these 8 people. With Xiao Chen's strength and the many young geniuses from the 7th realm around, Xiao Chen could easily destroy the human emperor sect and then take over the entire human emperor continent. In that case, why would Xiao Chen make the extra effort to send them back? After thinking about it, there was only one explanation. Combined with Xiao Chen's words, the Hachibara Senkai's real purpose in coming to the human emperor continent this time was to prevent the destruction of the second wilderness. However, their loyalty to the will of the heavenly way for many years made it impossible for them to trust Xiao Chen in a short period of time. Therefore, they fell into a dilemma and were confused at the moment. At this point, the two of them paused for a moment before continuing. "In short, the two of us feel that there are many suspicious points in this matter, so we can't come to a conclusion at the moment." No conclusion. Hearing this, the white-haired old man didn't say a word. The great sage present were no longer as agitated as before. Instead, they all fell into deep thought. The same words coming from different mouths sounded completely different. Think about it, if those words were not spoken by these two, but by Xiaochen, everyone present would probably not believe them at all. They would only think that Xiaochen was trying to sow discord. However, it was different now. These words came from the mouths of two great holy emperors of the human emperor sect, so the meaning was completely different. As great holy emperors of the human emperor sect, these two naturally had no reason to harm the human emperor sect. Everyone fell into deep thought. After hearing what the two of them said, everyone also felt that there were many suspicious points in this matter. After a moment of silence, the white-haired old man was the first to break the silence. Your doubts are not without reason. By the way, did the powerhouse of the Hachibara Senkai leave behind any words? Since they had released them, they must have left behind some words. After hearing the white-haired old man's question, the two of them recalled what Xiaochen said before he left. They immediately answered truthfully. Master, that person said that he will personally come to the human emperor sect in 3 days. Personally come to the human emperor sect? Surprise flashed through the white-haired old man's eyes when he heard that. After a while, he said slowly, since that's the case, let's wait for him to come. The human emperor sect could not stop Xiaochen from personally visiting the human emperor sect. Since they could not stop him, they could only let nature take its course. Moreover, after what had happened before, the white-haired old man wanted to see the Hachibara Senkai's heir with his own eyes as well as find out the truth behind the great changes in the second wilderness. Since Xiaochen had said that the second wilderness was on the brink of destruction, they could not let their guard down. After all, this was a critical matter that concerned the survival of the entire second wilderness. No one present objected to the white-haired old man's words. Of course, even if they objected, it would be useless because no one in the human emperor sect could stop Xiaochen from doing anything. The arrival of Xiaochen and the others made everyone on the human emperor continent nervous. Everyone was curious and nervous, but no one dared to approach Xiaochen and the others rashly. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. On the morning of the 4th day, Xiaochen gave the order to set off for the human emperor sect. He had given the human emperor sect enough time to prepare, but Xiaochen was still not confident that he could convince the human emperor sect. Hongxiu stood on the deck. Seeing how Xiaochen was still in deep thought, she gently chuckled. Don't think about it anymore. Just let nature take its course. Please add me to your collection. Please recommend me. Chapter 1724. In order to persuade the human emperor sect, Xiaochen had been frowning for the past 3 days. Clearly, he had been thinking of a way to persuade the human emperor sect. Seeing Xiaochen like this, Hongxiu's heart ached. Therefore, Hongxiu would often console Xiaochen, trying to cheer him up. After all, people's hearts could not be controlled. You could not control what others thought. Therefore, regardless of whether they could persuade the human emperor sect in the end, Hongxiu did not want to see Xiaochen like this. In the face of Hongxiu's consolation, Xiaochen nodded slightly. However, his brows were still furrowed. In just 3 days, the spiritual chi of heaven and earth has decreased by at least 40%. After 3 days in the human emperor continent, the spiritual chi of heaven and earth on the human emperor continent had decreased by another 40% compared to when they had just arrived. The speed was so fast that it was a little ridiculous. With the current speed of the spiritual chi of heaven and earth, the spiritual chi of heaven and earth would no longer exist in the human emperor continent. In other words, the human emperor continent would become a land of death. The speed was much faster than expected. Xiaochen was helpless about this. However, compared to Xiaochen, today was the day that Xiaochen would personally visit the human emperor sect. Early in the morning, the 18 great sages of the human emperor sect gathered in the main hall, waiting for Xiaochen's arrival. In just 3 days, it was obvious that the great sages of the human emperor sect all had grave expressions on their faces. Xiaochen could feel that the spiritual chi of heaven and earth on the human emperor continent was rapidly dissipating. Naturally, they could feel it too. Moreover, as natives of the human emperor continent, they were all very worried about the great changes that were happening to the human emperor continent. It was hard to imagine what would happen to the human emperor continent if the spiritual chi of heaven and earth on the human emperor continent disappeared. The great sages of the human emperor sect were no longer as angry as they were a few days ago. Now, they were only worried and distressed. In the main hall, everyone was silent as they waited for Xiao Chen's arrival. More than 2 hours later, a starship slowly arrived above the human emperor sect. Sensing the aura of the starship, the white-haired old man in the lead opened his eyes and said in a deep voice, "They're here." As soon as he finished speaking, everyone in the main hall disappeared at the same time and appeared in the sky in front of the black starship. Many disciples of the human emperor sect were confused by the sudden appearance of the black starship and the great sage emperors. However, what surprised them even more was that 3 youths, 2 men and 1 woman, flew over from the black starship. Facing the 3 youths, the 18 great sages of the human emperor sect actually took the initiative to bow. They seemed to be very respectful. The 3 youths were none other than Xiaochen, Yu Shujin, and Hong Xiu. Seeing the great sages of the human emperor sect being so respectful to the 3 youths, the disciples of the human emperor sect were stunned. At the same time, they were also curious about the 3 youths' identities. Not caring about the feelings of the disciples below, the 3 youths took the initiative to bow to Xiaochen and the other 2. Then, the white-haired old man in the lead said, "May I ask which heir of the Hachibara Senkai has come to our human emperor sect?" He only guessed that Xiaochen was an heir of the Hachibara Senkai, but he didn't know which one. In response to the white-haired old man's question, Xiaochen said flatly, "Xiaochen from the 7th realm." Xiaochen. Hearing this, the great sages of the human emperor sect were somewhat confused. In the 7th wilderness, Xiaochen was very famous. However, in the 2nd wilderness, not many people knew Xiaochen. Of course, the great sages of the human emperor sect had heard of Xiaochen's name. After all, the 8 heirs of the Hachibara Senkai were the focus of attention in the 8th wilderness. "Oh, it's Xiaochen's heir. Please." They were stunned at first, but then they said. They took the initiative to invite Xiaochen to the main palace. Seeing this, Xiaochen didn't hesitate. He only took Yu Shujin and Hong Xiu into the main palace of the human emperor sect. In the main palace, everyone took their seats. Xiaochen naturally took the main seat. After all, with Xiaochen's cultivation in the immortal realm, probably no one else was qualified to take the main seat except for him. After calmly taking his seat, Xiaochen looked around at the great sages of the human emperor sect and said flatly, "I'm sure you already know why I'm here. I'll cut to the chase. I'm sure you've all seen the changes in the 2nd wilderness. Today, I'm here to discuss the matter of the 2nd wilderness with you." Xiaochen really didn't know how to beat around the bush. Therefore, he was very direct and immediately stated his intentions. Hearing Xiaochen's words, the great sages of the human emperor sect all fell silent. During these 3 days, the crowd had indeed thought about a lot of things. Many of them found that there were indeed many suspicious points in this matter. Moreover, from the various signs, the 8th desolation immoral world should not have the motive to destroy the 2nd desolation. In these 3 days, many people had already begun to hesitate. Of course, there were also a few who were still loyal to the will of the heavenly way of the 2nd wilderness. As soon as Xiaochen finished speaking, one of them stood up and shouted angrily at Xiaochen. "Humph, you bastards of the Hachibara Senkai really don't give up. You actually want to sow discord between us and the will of the heavenly way. What a joke. Let me tell you, the human emperor sect will never betray the will of the heavenly way." His eyes were filled with anger as if he couldn't wait to skin Xiaochen alive. Hearing this, a cold light flashed in Xiaochen's eyes. However, because of the purpose of his visit to the human emperor sect, Xiaochen suppressed his anger. He looked indifferently at the white-haired old man and said, "Is this the decision of the human emperor sect? If that's the case, I'll take my people and leave the human emperor continent. You can fend for yourselves." After saying that, without waiting for the white-haired old man to reply, Xiaochen looked at the person who had scolded him earlier and revealed a disdainful smile. "Brains are good things. I've already said what I wanted to say. If you still think that I'm trying to sow discord, then I have nothing to say. However, there is one thing I want to tell you. In my opinion, you are just a bunch of chickens and dogs. If I want to destroy you, it will only be a matter of moving my fingers. Against a bunch of chickens and dogs, I, Xiaochen, will not be so bored as to go through so much trouble to sow discord. That's all I've said. If the final decision of the human emperor sect is still the same, then I'll leave immediately. Since you want to die, no one will stop you. Xiaochen said indifferently. Hearing this, the eyes of the experts of the human emperor sect flashed with anger. However, due to Xiaochen's strength, they could only suppress the anger in their hearts. Author's note: I've released 20 chapters today. Brothers, I'm looking for monthly votes, recommendation votes, collection, thank you. This is the first chapter. Chapter 1725. All the great saints and emperors of the human emperor sect were furious at Xiaochen's rebuke. After all, no one would be happy to be called a useless person in front of their face. However, due to Xiaochen's cultivation and the white-haired old man's restraint, they did not explode on the spot. After taking a deep breath, the white-haired old man looked at Xiaochen and said coldly, Xiaochen, since you said that the great change in the second wilderness was caused by the will of the heavenly way, let me ask you, do you have any evidence? Evidence? Hearing this, Xiaochen said coldly without hesitation. No. Where could he find evidence? Did he want Xiaochen to rush into the camp of the 8 desolates and capture the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness in front of everyone? Did he want to tell everyone that he was the one who wanted to destroy the second wilderness? What a joke! After hearing Xiaochen's words, a cold look flashed across the white-haired old man's eyes. Without evidence, he naturally would not believe Xiaochen's one-sided words. Many warriors on the human emperor continent had believed in the will of the heavenly way for generations and treated the will of the heavenly way as a godlike existence. Now, Xiaochen wanted to make everyone give up on the will of the heavenly way with just one sentence. How was that possible? Although there were many points in this whole matter, these alone were not enough to make the white-haired old man believe Xiaochen and believe that all of this was done by the will of the heavenly way. Not only the white-haired old man, but the great sage of the human emperor sect also felt the same way. Even those who were loyal to the will of the heavenly way looked at Xiaochen with disdain. Xiaochen, you have no evidence. How can we believe you? Don't tell me it's just based on your one-sided story? It was indeed impossible for them to believe Xiaochen based on Xiaochen's one-sided statement. Xiaochen was slightly angered when he heard this, so he snorted in annoyance as well. It's up to you whether you want to believe it or not. I've already said that if you want to die, go ahead. No one will stop you. Ever since he entered the Moral Emperor continent, Xiaochen had been restraining his temper. Even when he was insulted by the great sage of the Moral Emperor sect, Xiaochen didn't kill him. His goal was to have a good talk with the Moral Emperor sect. Furthermore, Xiaochen had specially given the human emperor sect 3 days. However, it seemed like these 3 days had made the great sage of the human emperor sect realize that something was amiss, yet they were still willing to believe in the heavenly way. Asking him for evidence? What a joke! If Xiaochen had proof, why would he come to the human emperor sect? He could have just made the evidence public. Was there something wrong with his head? Suppressing his impatience, he tried to persuade the people of the Moral Emperor sect. However, it was a pity that they did not appreciate his kindness at all. He was here to rescue them, but in the eyes of the people of the Moral Emperor sect, Xiaochen was like an enemy. This wasn't just disappointment. They wanted to save people, but they didn't appreciate it. What was this feeling? They were being ignored. Faced with Xiaochen's cold and domineering attitude, the white-haired elder and the great sage of the human emperor sect's faces darkened completely. In their eyes, not only did Xiaochen accuse the second wilderness of the will of the heavenly way, but his attitude was also so arrogant. He had gone too far. Although no one present was a match for Xiaochen, it didn't mean that they were willing to be bullied by Xiaochen. Moreover, Xiaochen was the heir of the seventh wilderness of the Hachibara Senkai. He was the mortal enemy of all living beings. Coldness flashed in the elder's eyes. In the end, he looked at Xiaochen and said coldly, "Xiaochen, if that's the case, then there's nothing to talk about. The human emperor sect doesn't welcome you. Of course, if you want to destroy the human emperor sect out of humiliation, we're not afraid. We'll fight to the death rather than bow down to the Hachibara Senkai." He directly asked him to leave. Hearing this, Xiaochen's eyes flashed coldly. He didn't know what was good for him. Xiaochen's conversation with the human emperor sect wasn't pleasant. It could even be said that it had completely failed. At the same time, Yi Xiao and the others who were on the other continents of the second wilderness weren't making good progress either. The Tianming continent was one of the 7 continents of the second wilderness. It was a continent ruled by the divine race. At this moment, in the main hall of the Tianming sect, Yi Xiao and a group of the great sage of the divine race gathered together. At this moment, these great sages of the divine race were all bruised and swollen. Their auras were also extremely weak. It was obvious that they had just been beaten up. As for the person who had beaten them up, needless to say, it was Yi Xiao, who was standing in the middle of the hall with a face full of anger. Yi Xiao and Xiaochen were the same. After arriving at the Tianming continent, they wanted to use the great sage sects on the Tianming continent to open up the situation. This was because as long as they could convince these great sage, the rest of the matter would be easy to handle. After all, as the great sage, their prestige wasn't low. Unfortunately, Yi Xiao's experience was almost the same as Xiaochen's. These great sages of the divine race were loyal to the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness to the point of madness. No matter what Yi Xiao said, they wouldn't believe him. They even insisted that Yi Xiao wanted to sow discord between them and the will of the heavenly way. Faced with the stubbornness of these great sages of the divine race, Yi Xiao was naturally dizzy with anger. In the end, he had no choice but to teach them a lesson. But even so, these great sages of the divine race still didn't have the slightest intention of giving in. They still didn't believe a single word Yi Xiao said. They still firmly believed that the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness would come back to save them. Stubborn, a bunch of idiots. The person who wants to kill you is the will of the heavenly way, and you still have the delusion that he will come to save you? What a bunch of idiots. Sigh. No, I can't. I'm so angry that I'm dizzy. After scolding angrily, Yi Xiao held his head and said helplessly. They couldn't kill them, but they didn't believe them at all. What should they do? While Yi Xiao was depressed, Guan Hong, Fu Rui, Quan Feng, Qiu Ru, and Lu Xiao were also in the same predicament. The people of the second wilderness didn't believe them at all. No matter how they tried to persuade them, in the eyes of the people of the second wilderness, the Hachibara Senkai were a bunch of thieves, and the will of the heavenly way of the second wilderness would definitely come to save them. Faced with the ignorance of the second wilderness saints, Xiaochen and the other heirs of Kunlun were completely helpless. While Xiaochen and the others were at their wits' end, in the outside world, Luoli and the others, who had been making preparations, gathered in the main hall with gloomy expressions. Is it too late? Luoli said faintly, a look of helplessness flashing across his eyes. Upon hearing this, Qingyan added, they're moving faster than we thought. Judging from their progress, they won't even need a month. In half a month at most, the second wilderness will be completely finished. As for us, we'll need at least 20 days to prepare. Chapter 2, Please collect, please vote, please recommend. Chapter 1726. Luoli and Qingyan spoke one after another. Hearing this, Yi Xian, Zuoting, Hong Lian, and the others all had unsightly expressions on their faces. Originally, the second desolate land still had a chance of survival, but now, because of the actions of the will of the heavenly way, the second desolate land's destruction had sped up. According to the current speed, the second desolate land would be destroyed in at most half a month. As for Luoli and the others, they would need at least 20 days to prepare. After all, the will of the Heavenly Way had been preparing for the destruction of the Second Desolate Land for a long time, and Luoli and the others were completely unprepared. Therefore, in terms of time, it would definitely be difficult for them to catch up to the will of the Heavenly Way. However, what Luoli and the others didn't expect was that the will of the Heavenly Way would be so decisive. They didn't give the Second Desolate Land any chance at all. From the extraction of the origin energy to the destruction of the Second Desolate Land, the entire process took less than a month. It was obvious that they had carefully prepared for it. Facing the will of the Heavenly Way, who could be said to be completely prepared, Luoli and the others seemed to be unable to do anything. Originally, they couldn't bear to see the many creatures in the Second Desolate Land being destroyed, but now, it seemed that there was no other way. After letting out a light sigh, Swating finally said, "The Second Desolate Land is hopeless. As for the people, let's save as many as we can. Send out all the starships in our hands and take as many people as we can." It was already impossible to save the Second Desolate Land, so they could only do their best. There was less than half a month left, so Swating suggested that all the starships in the Seven Realms be placed in the Second Desolate Land and take as many people as they could. Hearing Swating's words, the others nodded helplessly. Relying on starships to save people was just a drop in the bucket for the entire Second Desolate Land. In the vast Second Desolate Land, there were hundreds of billions of creatures. How many could they save with starships alone? 1 million or 2 million? They could only save a few million people, and this was counting the palaces of the Seven Realms. At most, they could only save so many people. However, for the entire Second Desolate Land, it was simply a drop in the bucket. But what other good ideas could they have? There was no other way. As for the final destination of these people, they could only go to the First Desolate Land, because the Second Desolate Land would definitely be destroyed by then. After agreeing with Swating's suggestion, Luoli added, "In that case, let's get ready. Also, send a message to those little fellows. Tell them that they don't have to persuade them anymore. Let's hurry up and take away the cultivation resources from the Second Wasteland. Also, they don't have to worry about the rescue." Since the Second Desolate Land was hopeless, they naturally couldn't let go of the cultivation resources. Before the Second Desolate Land was destroyed, they naturally had to take away as many precious cultivation resources as they could find. Hearing Luoli's words, the Realm Lords nodded in agreement. Soon, new orders were issued from Luoli and the others. For a time, all the starships in the Seven Realms entered the Second Desolate Land. Some experts of the older generation also followed these starships to the Second Desolate Land, specifically in charge of the rescue work. In the Seventh Realm, nearly 100 starships sailed towards the Second Desolate Land. On one of the starships, Wine Daoist and Li Qiu stood on the deck. Having heard about the Second Desolate Land, Wine Daoist was willing to go to the Second Desolate Land to participate in the rescue. Looking at the entrance to the Second Desolate Land in the distance, Wine Daoist sighed and said, "How many people can we save in the end with the starships?" Using starships to rescue the creatures in the First Desolate Land, the final outcome could be imagined. The number of people who could be saved could only be said to be very few. Save as many as we can. We'll do our best. Hearing Wine Daoist's words, Li Qiu smiled bitterly. Hearing Li Qiu's words, Wine Daoist's heart was filled with helplessness. Apart from that, there was also a strong sense of hatred. It was hatred towards the will of the Heavenly Way. What a cruel heart. The creatures in the First Desolate Land were killed just like that. This was the true intention of the will of the Heavenly Way. It was laughable that he had such a longing for the will of the Heavenly Way in the past. Wine Daoist mocked himself, but at this point, even Luoli and the others couldn't do anything. What could Wine Daoist do? Just like Li Qiu said, save as many as you can and do your best. Starships of different sizes set off for the Second Desolate Land. At the same time, Xiaochen and the others, who were on the 7 continents of the Second Desolate Land, also received new orders from Luoli and the other Realm Lords. Xiaochen, who was in the main hall of the Human Emperor sect, was about to leave. These people were simply stubborn and pedantic. They simply couldn't open their eyes to see the truth. They only knew that they were loyal to the will of the heavenly way. Just as he was about to leave, a sound transmission talisman suddenly turned into a ray of light and instantly entered Xiao Chen's mind. The content of the sound transmission talisman was the new order that Luo Li had given to Xiao Chen. The content was very simple. The second desolate land has been rescued. Collect cultivation resources and prepare to evacuate from the second desolate land. There was no saving the second desolate land. Xiao Chen didn't need to persuade the people of the second desolate land. Now, Luo Li had given Xiao Chen a new task. He was to collect cultivation resources on the second desolate land and take as many as he could. After receiving Luo Li's new order, Xiao Chen was obviously stunned. Although he was angry, Xiao Chen didn't feel good when he saw that the people of the second desolate land could only wait for death. After hearing Xiao Chen's cold voice, the white-haired old man and the other realm lords of the human emperor sect were also puzzled. Then, one of them shouted coldly, "What? You don't want to leave? Are you angry out of humiliation and want to destroy the human emperor sect? Or do you want to slaughter the entire human emperor continent?" Hearing this person's words, Xiao Chen slowly came back to his senses. He looked at this person with pity. That's right, pity. In Xiao Chen's opinion, the great sage of the human emperor sect was indeed very pitiful. They didn't even know that they were about to die. However, pitiful people must have their own detestable aspects. His original intention was to save people, but no one believed him. Now, the entire second desolate land was hopeless. Therefore, whether they believed him or not, the second desolate land's fate was sealed, and so was their fate. Without much emotion on his face, Xiao Chen looked at the white-haired old man and said indifferently, "Take me to the human emperor sect's treasury." Since Luo Li had given a new order, Xiao Chen naturally had to carry it out. If there was a place with the most treasures on the human emperor continent, it would undoubtedly be the human emperor sect. Chapter 3, Seeking Collection, Seeking Monthly Votes, Seeking Recommendation. You're tuning into the Mythic Realms YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.